She wondered if she was so powerless. She was from the greatest line of the Lombardy Empire. The greatest family had a name that goes hand in hand with the symbol of the world tree. It was a symbol of eternal prosperity, a family that had reached the top thanks to a rich history and impressive capital. The great house left its mark on culture wars and even art. However, the stupid heirs squandered all their wealth, and the house itself fell because of the wrong choice. A great and powerful family was destroyed in just 2 years. The lady knew that in this life everything would be different. She really wanted to try again and save her father. She was puzzled because her father left this world too early. Unfortunately, she lost her grandfather, who recognized hers. She lost the people she loved with all her heart and trusted. She lost the boy who was left in complete and endless loneliness. The young man looked intently at the lady, and holding out his hand to her, said that it was time for them to go. The young lady took the crown prince's hand with a radiant smile. A moment later, the huge doors swung open before them, and the sun's rays illuminated them. The young lady was outraged and told the young men that they could not leave the family property in a gambling house. She was furious and screamed that this was not the first time the young man, in turn, did not listen to her and angrily hit her in the face. He angrily asked who she was to lecture him. The young man approached his friend and asked him to calm down a little. He looked at the girl with cold fury, and she froze in place for a moment. He came closer to her and hit her in the face with fury. He asked angrily if she had really gotten a little of the family's remedy, and she immediately decided that they were all hers. The young Q froze for a moment. She was in great pain. He said with disdain that although they shared the same last name, she was not purebred and would never become part of their family. As he left, he said that she could simply continue to serve, but if she complained to her grandfather, she would not get off easy. Some time later, the young lady stood all alone. The young man looked at her intently and extended his hand to her with a smile. Ferenzi slowly extended her hand to him and began to exit the carriage. The young man looked at her tenderly and kissed her hand with a playful smile. She shyly pulled away from him and screamed, calling his name. A moment later, she said that they had to go quickly because they couldn't keep people waiting for them, and he looked at her intently because he saw that she was very embarrassed. Ferris said with a smile that in the entire empire there would be no one who would be outraged if she made him wait a little. He smiled and said that they should enjoy this moment because she had come a long way. She sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that because she had to go through a dog's life. She looked into the distance and said in all seriousness that this was no excuse for being rude. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she was ready. He smiled and said that it was time for them to go. She looked at him with a smile and said that everything was correct. A moment later, the young man announced that His Highness the Crown Prince and head of the Robardi family Fientia had arrived at the banquet hall Lombardy. People stood at the gates of the estate. They said that the great family would not escape the punishment of betrayal. The young lady, in turn, was furious because she knew that the first prince was nothing special and could not become the crown prince. The Lombardi had a world tree on their coat of arms, a name synonymous with eternal prosperity, a family that brought the first emperor to the throne. They amassed enormous wealth through influence, war art, and culture, and they left their mark all over the world. The imperial family, feeling threatened by them, gave orders to limit the family's powers after Rulak Lombardi headed it. However, the Duke immediately invented the grant system, and without separating aristocrats and commoners, he cultivated excellent specialists. Those same specialists then touched upon all areas of activity and also took high positions, and as a result, the previous emperor himself canceled the order given to them. The young lady was furious. She didn't understand how the great family could be destroyed in just a few years. A Lombardi for a time. She was a little girl who lived in South Korea and who died in a car accident. The young lady, in turn, was very surprised when she first opened her eyes in the body of a baby. She let out a cry of delight, for she thought she had been born with a golden spoon in her mouth. Only later did she realize that she was very much mistaken. Her father, Gallagher Lombardi, was the third son of the previous head of the family. Her mother died in childbirth and was a commoner, and was not recognized as an official bride. The young lady, in turn, still received her father's love and a surname with permission from her grandfather, but she still remained an illegitimate child. Her father passed away a few days before her 11th birthday, after which she was gradually forgotten, since only her father took care of her. For this reason, when she turned 15, she herself began to work for the family. She understood perfectly well that her persistence became the engine of her progress. Fortunately, her skills weren't that bad either, so she gradually gained more and more importance in the estate. From the age of 18, she already managed the household. She helped her grandfather with his duties when he fell ill. She knew perfectly well that her father's brothers were simply incompetent, but unfortunately, she never got to enjoy this privilege. The Duke looked at her intently and said that if he had known earlier that she was so skilled, he would have bequeathed their family to her. She smiled and told her grandfather that this was not true and that she was simply a dropout and that she would not be able to lead their family at all. He sighed heavily and told her to stop because she was still part of their family, and he knew that she had every right to the inheritance. He looked at her closely and asked for forgiveness because he knew that he should have been more attentive to her when she was still very little. The man looked at her intently and said that she knew what she had to do. He shouted angrily at her to leave immediately. The lady in turn froze in place from shock, as she did not expect such a thing at all. He looked at her with contempt and said that she tolerated her only because of her father. But his patience snapped. He shouted that she was just an illegitimate daughter. The young lady bowed her head low and began to beg him, as she wanted to stay and continue working for their family. She said what was needed here. He looked at her with a fierce grin and said that she definitely didn't know her place. With lightning speed, he slammed the door in her face and shouted at her not to dare come near their house. She was furious because she was simply thrown out into the street. She dedicated the best years of her life to her family. She screamed that they should have just stuck with the second prince. She understood perfectly well that they needed brains to understand this. She knew that the second principal was 100 times more suitable for the role of emperor. Ferris's second principal, Bravachau Durali, whose genius was despised because he was born a maid. She knew that her family was simply stupid because they followed the first prince and stooped to dirty talk against the second prince. Some time later, she left the tavern and wandered down a dark street. She sighed heavily, as unfortunately, she almost fell, but managed to stay on her feet in time. The young lady was puzzled and very frightened. A moment later, she turned around, not realizing where she was. But at that very moment, she froze in surprise as she saw a carriage rushing towards her and a horse hanging on it. She knew that in her past life, she died in an accident, and this time she was run over by a crew. Opening her eyes, the young lady froze for a moment as she saw the silhouette of her father. She called out to him in surprise. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened to her. She was taken aback and quickly sat up. Gallagher flinched, as he did not expect this. She was confused and did not understand what was happening. She knew she had definitely been hit by a carriage, but she didn't understand why she had suddenly found herself in the library. The man looked at his daughter in surprise and called her. He looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. She froze for a moment, with tears in her eyes. She didn't understand why everything was so alive. She didn't understand anything at all, because at that moment, there was only one thought in her head. She knew she had to get out of the library first. She looked at her father intently and asked if she could go into the room for a moment. He smiled and said that she could do it, and also asked if he should walk her home. While running away, she shouted that she could get there herself, and also said that she would be back soon. He shouted at her not to run because she might fall. She glanced sideways at the library, knowing that this classification had been in use before she had changed everything. The young lady knew that there was a guest room somewhere nearby. She ran into the room with lightning speed and froze in surprise because she did not understand why she was so small. She didn't know how old she was now, but she knew that she had fallen and gotten the scar when she was 8 years old. She noticed that it was missing now. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was not yet 8 years old. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had experienced rebirth and rebirth. She looked out the window and noticed that the trees were in place. The tree seedlings had been sent by the first emperor in honor of the completion of the estate. She sighed heavily because she understood that if her father had not died so early, everything could have been different. She thought for a moment as she remembered when her father passed away. She remembered that the cure for his illness was invented a few years later. She sighed heavily and wondered if she could save her father. A moment later, she burst into tears as she realized she could do it. She knew it sounded like something impossible, but she went back in time, and all the necessary knowledge remained in her head. She sighed heavily as she knew that she would be able to protect her father and her family. A moment later, she looked out into the street and froze for a moment as she remembered the fall of her family. She understood perfectly well that she needed to calm down, because this had not happened yet. She knew that she needed to prevent Vedsa from becoming the head of the clan. Weeds's wife, Seraglio, and the mother of the first prince, Empress Labini. The Anginas are cousins, so Vidzi supported the prince. She knew that she needed to appoint another person to take the place of the head of the clan, someone who would support the second prince. She remembered the words of her grandfather, who on his deathbed said that if he had noticed her earlier, he would have bequeathed everything to her. She thought for a moment and wondered if she should try. She wondered why she didn't work ahead and contact the second prince in advance. She sighed heavily and decided that she should try after all. She looked into the distance and told herself that she would become the mistress, but she knew that, for this, she would need her grandfather's trust. The man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that Mr. Gellner had been summoned by the head of the clan and went into the office. She looked closely at the librarian, as she knew that in her past life, she had started working at the library after he had retired due to illness. Ferentia knew that he was originally a famous professor at the academy. She looked at him intently and asked him with a smile to lend her one book. He smiled and asked what book she wanted. The young lady smiled and said that she would like to read the book People from the South. The librarian looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like this from such a young person. He looked at her in surprise and asked if the gentleman had asked her by chance. She smiled and said that it was not so, and that she would read it. Some time later, the young lady walked down a long corridor. A moment later, she froze in place, as she realized that she had already arrived in her grandfather's office. She decided to wait a little near the office until the meeting ended. She was happy because she finally had the opportunity to read the book that she had been looking for and wanted to read for a long time. Ferentia was puzzled because she was unable to read it before her death. She wanted to read it from cover to cover. A moment later, a young man approached her and said with a grin that she was inferior. Tia was taken aback because she heard a familiar voice. A moment later, Tia turned around and saw the boys in front of her. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock, as she did not expect to see them. She was surprised and didn't understand what they were doing here. The eldest grandson of Rardy was a terrible libertine. Velesak had new passions every time, and Astaliu squandered the family's money in gambling. Tia knew they were just mean young people, but now she saw that they were very small. The young lady in turn could not restrain herself and burst into wild laughter. Looking at the young people, they looked at her in surprise and wondered if she had really gone mad. She realized that she had lost control and laughed. Tia knew that she had made a mistake, and they could get angry. The young man looked at her with fury and asked who she was laughing at, calling her a dirty inferiority. Tia froze with rage. They looked at her intently and said mockingly that she seemed a little angry while insulting her. The young man looked at her mockingly and asked if she was going to cry and wet herself again. Tia looked at them and asked how old she was now. He looked at her in surprise. She asked again how old she was. Now Tia asked mockingly, did he really not even know that? Velesak shouted angrily that he knew perfectly well that she was 7 years old. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she now realized how old she really was. She looked at him intently and said that it was all true. Tia looked at them and shouted that Velesak was 10 years old and Astaliu was 8. She said that they were very big, but still behaved uncultured. Tia said that they should not make fun of their cousin. The young man looked at her mockingly. He rushed towards his cousin with lightning speed as he was very angry. Velesak looked at her with fury and shouted that she had truly gone mad. And with the speed of lightning, he raised his hand to hit her. The young lady in turn looked at him intently. She did not move from her place, preparing to take the blow. The young man was furious. He did not understand how someone like her dared to stare at him. He looked at her mockingly and asked how an inferior mixture could lecture him. He grabbed the girl by the hair and said mockingly that it seemed like she had somehow decided that she was their equal since they shared the same last name. He shouted that she was a commoner and inferior. He insulted her for some time. She sighed heavily and said that she had previously told her not to do this. He froze for a moment and looked at Tia in surprise. He was amazed. The young lady in turn looked at him with cold fury. A moment later, she struck him with cold fury and shouted that she had told them not to call her inferior. The young man fell to the ground, with a thud, screaming and spinning around on the ground in pain. Astalia was taken aback, and trembling with fear, he approached his brother and called him. The young lady in turn looked at the young man with cold fury. He froze for a moment as he became frightened by her intense gaze. With lightning speed, the young man rose to his feet and shouted at his sister that she was crazy. He was shocked and asked if she really thought she could get away with it. He froze in place in surprise and fear as he saw her fierce and cold gaze. The young lady in turn shouted at him that he was an ill-mannered puppy and, swinging a book, began to beat him. Astalia froze in shock. The young lady was furious. She shouted that he should have been prepared to get back at him for his words. She screamed furiously that he would now know how to anger the inferior boy, who writhed and screamed. She remembered how in her past life he beat her without mercy and insulted her in every possible way. The young man, trembling with fear and bursting into tears, looked at his sister. He screamed and prayed for salvation. Some time later, men came out of the office and heard noise in the corridor. They froze in shock as they saw the amazing sight. The young lady and her brother froze in place, as they did not expect their parents to come out of the office so early. The man screamed and called for his son. He was shocked by what he saw. A moment later, he ran up to his son and pushed the girl away, causing the lady to fall to the ground with a crash. Gallagher ran up to his daughter with lightning speed and asked if she was hurt. The young man threw himself into his father's arms. A moment later, he screamed very loudly. Tia sighed heavily as he screamed as if something was broken. The man looked at the young lady with fury and shouted at her to apologize to his son immediately. The young lady, in turn, turned away from them. She had no intention of doing so. The man was furious. He reached out to his niece and shouted that she was arrogant. Gallagher was shocked. He stopped his brother. A moment later, the Duke came out into the corridor. He looked at them with fury and shouted at them to calm down immediately. For a moment, there was dead silence in the corridor. The atmosphere was very tense. The Duke looked intently at Astalia and said that he must explain everything that had happened. The man looked at his son closely and said that he should speak because their grandfather had asked him to explain everything. The boy, in turn, trembling with fear, hesitated. He did not know what to say. A moment later, he said that he and his brother were just walking down the hallway when their sister suddenly pounced on them. He said with tears in his eyes that the young lady kicked his brother, and he fell down immediately, and then she started hitting him with a book. The young lady in turn was furious. Tia did not understand what he was saying because she knew he was lying. Tia looked closely at her brother as she understood that he was now distorting the fact in such a way, despite the fact that he himself was to blame for everything. Tia was in shock and did not understand how anyone could believe this. She looked menacingly at everyone present. The young lady looked intently at her grandfather, but he did not answer. The Duke looked closely at his grandson and asked if his granddaughter had just started fighting with her brother. The boy hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Velisac cried out that his sister had always hated them. The Duke looked at his grandson with cold fury and told him not to interfere in other people's conversations. The Duke looked closely at his grandson and asked why he did not know this norm of decency. The boy backed away and shuddered. The young lady looked at them intently. She understood that her grandfather hated it more than anything in the world when people interfered in other people's conversations. The Duke looked closely at his granddaughter and asked if she would try to talk about this situation. For a moment, she froze in place, not knowing what to answer. She pressed herself closer to her father. Tia knew that before she would have simply run away, but now she looked closely at her father and encouraged him with her eyes. She understood perfectly well that now everything was different, and she was different. She looked intently at everyone present and said that she was not guilty of anything. The man shouted at her in anger because she had brought his son to a critical condition. He did not understand how she dared to say now that she was not to blame for this situation. The Duke angrily called his son Viedza, backed away and shuddered. She looked closely at her uncle. Because she understood that his son had just made the same mistake as he had, she understood that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she was just waiting for her father in the hallway, and her brothers came and suddenly started calling her names and making fun of her. She said that she asked them not to do that, but they hit her for it. The Duke looked at her intently and asked who hit her. Tia looked at everyone present and said that the first Vedasak hit her. The young man shuddered with fear. She looked at them and said that he called her a lowly creature, and he also told her to get out to the common people's slums. Gallagher froze in shock. He didn't expect this. She understood perfectly well that her father was going through a very hard time right now, but she knew that he had to endure it. The young lady knew perfectly well that now she simply had to reveal how she had been treated. She had to show how rotten the children were. The Duke asked in surprise if that was the reason she raised her hand against her brother. She said that she hit him because he said that she was not Rardy. She looked at them intently and said that she was inferior. She knew that her mother had not been able to get permission for the surname. She said that even though she was defective, she was definitely Rardy, and she was the one the Duke had recognized. In her past life, having effectively run the house, she painfully realized that the fact of her existence did not mean that she was inferior. She understood perfectly well that she was no different from them. The Duke asked in surprise if she had hit him, not because he had called her a beast. He looked at her intently and didn't ask if she did it, because he said she wasn't part of their family. She looked at the Duke intently and said that it was true. The Duke asked his granddaughter if her knees hurt. Tia sighed heavily and said that, of course, she was in pain. He noticed with surprise that she was not crying at all. She smiled and said that, of course, she would cry. But after she said everything she wanted, she looked intently at the Duke and said that later she would go into the room and cry. There the Duke was taken aback because he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he burst out laughing, and everyone present looked at the Duke in surprise. The man looked at his father intently and asked for forgiveness, saying that he needed to take care of his daughter's wounds. The Duke smiled and said that he could go. A moment later, the young lady shouted to her father to wait for her, and with the speed of lightning, she turned and walked in the direction where her book was. A few minutes later, she returned with a book in her hands. Everyone looked at her in surprise. She bowed and said with a smile that she should not throw the book at all. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had borrowed this book. Tia timidly said that it was true and asked for forgiveness. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was apologizing. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she had treated her badly. She said that the book was not needed to harm people. He smiled and said that just recently, she said that she was not guilty of anything. She said with a beaming smile that she believed that when you realize your guilt, it is important to admit it quickly. The Duke smiled and said that everything was correct, and also said that they could disperse the young people, looked at their conversation in surprise. Vidza shouted and asked his father if he would just turn a blind eye to this. He shouted that the girl had done something like this to the eldest grandson of the family. The man was furious and shouted that the girl must be immediately punished accordingly. The Duke angrily asked his son if he dared to dispute his decision. The man backed away and trembled with fear and said that it was not so. He was puzzled and did not know what else to say. As he left, the Duke said that he was putting an end to it. He said that they should stop quarreling and go their separate ways as quickly as possible. Everyone looked at the Duke intently, as each side was surprised by his actions. Gallagher bowed to all present and said that this was the will of their father. He said that it was time for him to leave. As he was leaving, the man turned around and called his brother. He looked at his brother with cold fury and asked if he was taking childish pranks too seriously. The young lady in turn looked at everyone present and stuck her tongue out at them. Everyone was shocked. They did not expect that the father and daughter would act like this. The young lady in turn hugged her beloved father tightly. She loved his delicate scent very much. Gallagher ran around his daughter while she was being treated. He was excited and hoped that she would not have a scar. She knew that if everything had gone as it had in her past life, she would have received a scar in that place only a year later. She was glad that she had not broken anything. The doctor looked at her and asked if she had any pain anywhere. A moment later, the young lady showed her hand and said that it hurt. She knew that when her uncle suddenly pushed her and she fell on the floor incorrectly, she understood that he had a very low mind, and that was why he did it. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and said that there was nothing serious wrong with her, but he would still prescribe her a special ointment. The man looked at the doctor intently and thanked him for the examination. He said that he would at least like to talk to his daughter and asked the doctor to step out for a minute. The doctor smiled and said that he would do everything, and also, if they needed his help, he would be in the lab. The young lady in turn looked intently after the doctor. Gallagher looked closely at his daughter and called her. He was a little upset, and looking at his daughter, asked why she didn't immediately tell her father that the boys were tormenting her. Tia looked closely at her father as she saw his worried gaze. The young lady looked intently into his eyes. They were the same color as hers. She looked at him intently and said that the boys said they would beat her more often. If she told Gallagher jumped up from his seat, he was furious. She looked closely at her father and said with a smile that there was nothing to worry about, because today she had given away her dacha and no one would say anything about her anymore. She looked at her father intently and said with a smile that she had endured until now, but would not do it anymore. She smiled and said that she would hit them back, and if they didn't understand, she would run and cry to the adults. She smiled and told her father that he didn't need to worry at all, because she was fine. He sighed heavily and hugged his daughter with a gentle smile. He said that she was doing everything right and should continue to do so. He sighed heavily and asked why she called him father. He asked his daughter to call him as always. The young lady was taken aback as she remembered that at that age she called him daddy. A moment later, the young lady looked at her father and called out to him with a smile. He smiled and said that everything was right. Tia said with a smile that they should definitely live happily ever after together. He smiled and said that everything would be just like that. She knew that her father would hardly understand her words, but she knew that this time he would not die. Tia knew perfectly well that she had to protect her family and her father. The young lady understood perfectly well that the first thing she needed to do was open her grandfather's eyes and get his confession. She thought for a moment about how best to do this. Tia knew that the eldest son was a complete fool, but because he was older, everyone perceived him as the head of the family. She was puzzled because she understood that her father only needed books to be happy. Tia knew she needed to smoke a few peaks in the meantime. Sometimes it seemed to her that her father simply did not exist. He asked if she was reading such an interesting book. She smiled and said that the book was interesting. She knew very well that she was very Yuna now, but she knew that in her past life, her grandfather could not entrust leadership to anyone. She knew that he had been pulling everything on himself until the very end, and for this reason, he had fallen ill. She understood that she needed to demonstrate her skills as soon as possible. The young lady sighed heavily, as she was only an illegitimate child and a girl, and all the weak points would not go away, even if she became the successor. She knew that at times they would tie her hand and foot, but she understood that this could be easily compensated for by the patronage of the crown prince. She knew that even if it wasn't for the sake of saving the family, she had to attract the attention of the second prince. She thought for a moment and remembered that, around this time, the second prince's mother was supposed to pass away. She understood that his mother had not received any treatment because she was locked in the cold palace. Tia knew that the prince's temperament was unusual. Now she knew that the prince was now spending days on end alone. The young lady wanted to increase her authority in the estate and immediately rushed to the young prince. A moment later, someone knocked on their office door. Gallagher looked out and looked at the man in surprise. He froze in place for a moment. The young man looked at him intently and asked if he could step outside for a moment. Firenze was surprised because she didn't expect to see Clairvon. Gallagher looked at him in surprise and asked if his father had asked him to pass on something urgently. Clairvon said that this was not the case. He looked intently at Tia and said that he had come to see her. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand the reason for his arrival. She knew that he was the Duke's right hand. The young lady knew very well that he would soon have to keep track of the family's trading groups. The Duke asked his assistant what he thought about the book his granddaughter had taken, and the young man said he thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding. The Duke asked his assistant in surprise what had caused his doubts, and he said that this book was a specialized manual for precise research. He said that this book was not intended for the young lady because she was still little, and it seemed that she just liked the cover. The Duke thought for a moment and said that with an ordinary child, everything could have been like that. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if the young lady was not an ordinary child. The Duke looked closely at the assistant and said that from now on, the young lady would be educated like other children. Claravan looked at the Duke intently and said that the young lady was still very young, and at that age it was difficult for children even to sit still for long. The Duke smiled and said that this is exactly how it is with ordinary children. He looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was hinting at something. The Duke thought for a moment and said that the young lady's mother was a nomad. He said she was incredibly beautiful, but that was the only thing that stood out about her. He looked at the assistant intently and said that her daughter could properly inherit the blood of his son. He looked at the young lady intently, for she seemed to him to be just a child without any potential. He looked at her intently and introduced himself with a smile. He said that he was the instructor of the young gentleman. He looked closely at the young lady, knowing that his master had most likely simply made a mistake. He told the Duke that he would conduct a kind of examination to find out the exact level of knowledge of the young lady. He told the Duke that even if the result did not meet expectations, he would not be able to force him to have sex with her. The lady looked at him with a smile and said that she was very pleased to meet him. Tia bowed to him with a smile and introduced herself. For a moment, the young man froze in place in surprise. She looked at him intently puzzled and called out. He was taken aback and said that she had given a perfect curtsy. He said with a smile that she was worthy of praise. She smiled and said that she tried to do everything according to the book. The young lady smiled for a moment, as she knew that she had taken etiquette lessons in her past life. She knew that Rambardi's lessons were actually the first stage of cold-blooded assessment. First of all, regardless of age, the right to participate is given only to those children who are ready for lessons. Also, the age of completion of classes is not defined, and notification that one can no longer attend classes sometimes meant the withdrawal of this right. The assessment that the children received during the lesson was immediately sent to the head of the clan. The head of the clan carefully monitors everything that the children say and do. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to ask her a couple of questions. He smiled and said that she should answer calmly. The young lady agreed with a smile. He looked closely at the book that was in the young lady's hands. She thought for a moment, because she realized that her grandfather had noticed the book. She knew that this was her chance. She smiled and said that she had been reading it since yesterday. He smiled and asked what the book was about. Tia said with a smile that she had not read much yet, but told him the contents of a few pages. He looked at her intently, as he was surprised, and asked who wrote the book. A moment later, the young lady said with a smile that the cover said Rofili. She looked at him intently, because she knew it was written all over his face, because he thought she was carrying the book around like a toy. She smiled and asked if he wanted to read the book. He said that he had already read this book. He understood that the young lady was not lying to him. He started talking about the author of the book, but the young lady said that he was mistaken, since the author was not a man but a woman. The young man froze in surprise. She showed him the book with a smile and said that this scientist woman wrote it. The man looked at her in surprise and asked to borrow the book for a while. She looked at him with a smile and said that it seemed like he had read the book superficially. Claravan looked at her closely, a smile on his face, as he realized that he had fallen victim to prejudice. He said with a smile that he had no more questions and that she could attend classes starting next Saturday. He smiled and said that it would be difficult for her to attend classes at first. She smiled and said that you are learning a lot of new things, and it will be very interesting. Gallagher, in turn, beamed with happiness, as he was very happy for his daughter. With lightning speed, he hugged his daughter tightly and told her that she was simply brilliant. He knew that the position of being responsible for training did not hold much promise. He already wanted to quit this position, but for a moment he thought that he should stay a little longer. He knew that it would be a pleasure for him to teach such a child. Sometime later, the young lady was reading a book with her father. Gallagher looked at his daughter with a smile and asked if she would like to go on a picnic with him. He smiled and said he had brought lots of her favorite cakes and cookies, and they could read a book together in the sun. She knew he was throwing bait at her, afraid she wouldn't want to go to the hospital. She smiled and said that she had just been thinking about that, and he smiled and said that it seemed like they had a lot in common. The doctor was teaching his assistant at the same time, but he froze for a moment. He turned around and saw the young gentleman with the Lady Gallagher, looked at the doctor, and asked if they were too much of a bother. The doctor smiled and said that this was not so because he had a lot of free time, and he was now giving advice to his student. Esther bowed and introduced herself, and the young lady, in turn, rushed towards the girl with lightning speed. Tia looked at her father closely and said that she would like to be treated by Esther. Everyone present was surprised and said that the doctor was on the other side, but the young lady was persistent. The doctor looked at them with a smile and said that it seemed that his assistant had captured the lady's heart. He smiled and said that his assistant was very capable, so she could treat the lady Tia bent over, because she was happy. Esther slowly began to examine the young lady. Tia looked at her closely, as she noticed that the girl was very nervous. Tia looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had a very beautiful name. A moment later, she introduced herself and said what her father's name was. Tia looked at the girl and asked if she was studying to be a doctor. Esther said that she was studying medical botany. They chatted casually for a while, and there was a friendly and warm atmosphere in the air. She smiled and said that the young lady's swelling had almost gone down, and so they could change the medicine. A moment later, the doctor looked at his student and told her what medicine he needed to bring her. The young lady looked closely at Esther as she saw that she had relaxed, and this was very good. Esther entered the room and brought medicine for the young lady. She said that after taking it, the swelling would immediately disappear. The young lady was shocked. She didn't want to drink anything like that at all. She looked at her father with tears in her eyes, hoping that he would allow her not to take the medicine. He smiled and said that he would give her some tasty cookies after she took the medicine. Tia sighed heavily as she understood that she had no choice, and with lightning speed, she began to take the medicine. The doctor smiled and said that she was a great girl and asked for the bottle back. She looked at them and said that since they had enlarged her, she would like to treat them to some cookies. They looked at the young lady in surprise, but still accepted the treat from her. Esther looked at the treat in surprise and sheepishly thanked the lady. The young lady in turn said goodbye to them with a radiant smile. Tia was glad that she met Esther. She understood that she needed to get closer to her. She thought for a moment because she knew that in her past life, at this same time, something happened in the estate. She knew that this was a vivid memory in her life. For a moment, she froze in surprise as she noticed the carriage and the coat of arms on it. The Duke looked at his assistant and asked how his granddaughter had done. Clairvan said that he already understood what the Duke had meant earlier. The Duke sighed heavily and said that before, as now, his assessment was very stingy. He looked closely at the Duke and said that after the examination, he had done a little probing of the servants in Mr. Galligan's entourage. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately no one noticed the lady's genius. He said that the young master was also a little surprised. The Duke thought for a moment. He looked at the Duke and said that it was assumed that the lady could have been hiding her abilities all this time. The Duke thought about his assistant's words. He sighed heavily and said that it was now clear to everyone that his son lacked influence and ability. He wondered if the situation was so bad that a little girl had to hide her skills. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they could watch first. The Duke told his assistant to tell him everything about the young lady right away. Vidza knocked on their office door. He looked at the closed door with a grin and said that people from the trading group had arrived. Clairvan looked at them closely and asked if they were really going to sell textiles in the capital, the turnover of which is carried out only in the eastern region. He asked if his current trading group couldn't fully take over such trading activities, so he asked them to arrange transportation. The man smiled and said that it was correct. He sighed heavily and said that it looked like they were going to borrow the payment for the textiles from Rardy's bank. The man smiled and said that that was exactly it, and he would like to ask them for a reserve amount. The young man sighed heavily. Vidza looked at his father closely and asked with a smile if he wanted to know anything else. He told his father that it was a great fortune. The man smiled and told everyone present not to worry about repaying the debt, because he was the head of the trading group, and he swears on the name of his family that he would not betray their trust. Clairvan was furious. He knew that this man was from the Empress's family, but he understood that they too must have a limit to their impudence. He understood that no one would dare to shake money out of a debtor when he was from the imperial family. He understood perfectly well that they would be responsible for the money and troubles, and the guild would only reap the benefits. He was a little puzzled because he understood that if the enterprise failed, his family would also bear the consequences. He understood that the owner could not accept such a terrible offer. The Duke looked at his son closely and said that he was entrusting this matter to him. He smiled and said that his son should make every effort and succeed. Claravan was shocked. He did not expect such a thing from his master. The young man looked at his father with a smile and said that he could trust him completely. He looked at the man with a smile and said that they could go into another room and discuss all the details. Claravan looked after them intently and asked for a minute of attention. He looked at them excitedly and said that they should first look at the goods and then discuss everything. He said that it was impossible to agree on anything without really knowing the product they would have to work with. Vidzi looked at the man intently and told him to ignore their worker. He looked at his father's assistant with fury and shouted that he did not understand how that simple assistant dared to interfere in his affairs. Vidzi understood perfectly well that he did not care how much money the business would bring in. He knew that money always goes hand in hand with power, and this debt would become his gold mine. After all, he always wanted to be on the same level as the imperial family. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that checking the goods was a perfectly feasible request. He looked hard at the head of the trading group and asked what he would say to that. The young man became nervous and called his father. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that they would do everything he said, that he had just prepared several copies and left some textiles in the capital's warehouse. He said that he would bring them another day. Vidze was taken aback and, looking at the man, asked for forgiveness because he felt a little uncomfortable about all this. Croyton said that everything was fine because this was the master's wish and he was quite capable of fulfilling his will. Claravan, in turn, was furious. He did not understand how much longer the young gentleman would lick the boots of the man who had been invited to borrow all their money and resources. He looked closely at his father and said with a smile that they were already leaving. Claravan sighed heavily. He did not understand where his master got such a son from. He looked at the Duke in bewilderment and said that this situation was very scrupulous and the deal would be unprofitable. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and asked what he would do if this proposal came from Shannonette. He looked at the Duke in surprise and said that she would never suggest such a thing because it was a very stupid proposal. The Duke thought for a moment and said that it was all true, but they needed to think carefully about whether the game was really not worth the candle. He sighed heavily and said that he had one child who was always overdoing it, another who didn't care about anything, and the third one was too weak-willed to do anything. He sighed heavily and said that, of all his children, his daughter was the best candidate. The Duke said that he unfortunately did not trust her husband. Looking at his assistant, he said that his daughter was doing well in everything, so he only looked after her. He knew that the head of the family should not interfere in the battle of the heirs, because this allows for the most objectivity. He sighed heavily and said that if that was the case, then he should at least support the offspring, who was at least trying to do something. He looked closely at the assistant and said that they would conduct another test. Claravan looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he had not recently placed great hopes on Lady Ferenzi. The Duke sighed heavily and said that his granddaughter was certainly intelligent, but they still knew too little about her innate abilities, and on top of that, she was still extremely young. He said that they could only watch. The Duke was well aware that the young lady's probationary period had only just begun. Some time later, the young lady came into the office where classes were to begin. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that if she had come to the wrong place, she could simply turn around and leave. But a moment later, she opened the doors and saw her relatives. Velisak looked at his sister in surprise, as he did not expect to see her. The twins Miran and Kilyu looked at the young lady in surprise. Lorraine also looked at her sister in surprise and called her. The young lady of the university, in turn, looked intently at everyone present, but did not answer. Velisak screamed with rage and asked what she was doing here. He was furious and didn't understand why she came to them. She looked at him intently and asked what he thought Tia said, that from today on, she would study with them. The young man was furious. He shouted that she was lying. He angrily asked if she was really saying that she was allowed to attend the same classes that he attended. She calmly said that everything was true, and her grandfather had allowed her. Velisak, in turn, shouted that she was simply a liar. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that there was simply no point in wasting her time on a small child She wanted to find a seat and sit down quickly. The twins came up to their sister with lightning speed and pushed their brother away. The young lady froze for a moment in shock, not understanding what they were doing now. She knew that in her past life, they didn't give a damn about her. She didn't understand what came over them now. They looked at her intently and asked if she really had fought with her brother. They smiled and asked if she had really won the fight. But the young man froze in place with rage as he understood that their words had hit his pride. A moment later, he shouted in anger that everything was not like that at all. He shouted that they would dance some more, because he would tell his father everything. The twins looked intently at the young lady and bombarded her with questions they wanted to know what she hit him with. Tia froze in shock on the spot. She did not understand what was happening at all. A moment later, the teacher entered their office, looked closely at everyone present, and said that it seemed that everything was in place. He looked at them with a smile and said that they could sit down now since they were about to start the lesson. Tia, in turn, was very glad that the lesson began without any problems, but she was still surprised and did not understand why the twins were attached to her sides. Tia remembered very well that the twins in her past life were not only not interested in her, they never even paid attention to her, even when she was beaten. They didn't even cast a glance at her, completely ignoring her and turning a blind eye to everything. She was puzzled and did not understand why they were suddenly behaving differently. Now the young lady felt wildly uncomfortable. Cliven said that today they would be learning the basic concept of business. She sighed heavily as she knew that everything else was not that different from her expectations. Tia saw and clearly heard that Velesak slept during lessons every time he behaved ignorantly. She thought that he was listening with the wrong part of his head during lessons, but she did not expect that her thoughts were so correct. She understood perfectly well that it was very strange that the teacher did not make a remark, but simply watched. She was surprised and did not understand why the teacher did not punish his student. She wondered why he did not even wake him up. She froze in surprise for a moment as she saw the teacher looking at her with a smirk. She flinched and wondered if he had smirked. She realized that he did not impose punishments or try to maintain discipline, and he did not even try to interest them in anything. She understood perfectly well that after the lesson, he would report everything to the Duke. The young lady knew that since she had come out like this, she had to prove herself. She looked closely at the teacher, as she wanted to show that she had listened to him diligently and attentively. After some time, the teacher announced that this would be the end of their lesson for today. He looked at them intently and said that he would give them special homework. The young lady looked at the teacher in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at his students closely and said with a smirk that he was giving them until next week. To complete the assignment, he smiled and pointed to the log. Everyone looked in surprise at the log that stood right in front of them. He smiled and said that it was strong and would grow quickly. He smiled and said that their homework was to sell the log and accordingly pay for it. He looked at everyone present and said with a smile that they should sell it any way they wanted. They could chop it or prick it. He said that if they wanted, they could burn it, and it made no difference to him. The teacher said that they were only forbidden to use their status to force a purchase, and they should only sell the tree to the person who needed it. The young lady looked at her brothers, as she knew that they were planning to do the same. The young lady looked at the teacher intently, and trembling asked if there really was only one log for everyone. The teacher smiled and said that it was not so, and it was only a sample of the log, for their assignment had already been delivered to their rooms. The young lady hesitated in embarrassment. She looked closely at her sister, as she could not believe that Velisak and Larine had emerged from the same womb. The young man looked at the teacher and said that he did not want to do this. He was irritated and did not understand why he should do such a thing. He said that such a sale of things could be entrusted to lower-ranking officials. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She realized that his mother had simply instilled in him the noble model of thinking. She understood that in his past life, he had thought that it was unseemly for an aristocrat to depend on money. The young lady understood perfectly well that such a model was yesterday's news, because today, even if a person was an aristocrat without money, he would not achieve anything. Moreover, the young lady knew very well that even the imperial family had established a trading group, but she knew that her brother and his mother were still saying such utopian things. The teacher looked at the young man intently and said that in that case there was nothing he could do, and he would have to give the young man a failing grade for the given assignment. The young man was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as he had not expected anything like this at all. With the speed of lightning, he suddenly rose up and, looking at the teacher, asked why everything was exactly like this. The teacher sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, he had no other choice. He said that the current task was to sell the item and get paid, but he himself said that he would not do it, and therefore his grade was unsatisfactory. The young man was in shock. He shouted at the teacher to change the assignment immediately because the problem was that it was simply ridiculous. The teacher smiled and said that whoever could get money for selling the tree and earned the largest amount would receive a separate reward from him. The young man left the office in anger. Tia sighed heavily. She understood that the boy was simply ill-mannered. She did not understand what good he could be at all. She knew perfectly well that she didn't need to think about it now, because now she needed to focus on the task. The twins looked at her intently as they wanted her to go with them. The lady understood perfectly well that the task itself sounded very simple, but if you think about it, it was incredibly difficult. She knew that the log itself would not fetch more than a couple of kopecks. Therefore, something had to be made from it in order to raise its value. She wanted to make something wooden that was in good demand, from rough dishes and toy furniture to a carved frame. She knew that wood was used in many places, and it was not an expensive or rare material. But she was puzzled because, unfortunately, she knew nothing about wood processing. She knew that if all went wrong, the cost price of the goods would be higher. Its selling prices, and thus not only would she not make money, but she would suffer losses. She wondered what she should do and how she should act. A moment later, a surprising thought came to her mind. With lightning speed, she bowed to the teacher and thanked him for today's lesson. She smiled, and as she left, said that she would try very hard on her homework. He looked at her closely, with a smile on his face, as he realized that she had already solved this problem, judging by her enthusiasm. He smiled as he understood that her actions made him look forward to the next lesson with anticipation. The young lady knew perfectly well that the person who could offer the highest and best price was a person from her family. With the speed of lightning, she burst into her father's office and called him. The man looked at his daughter in surprise, as he was a little puzzled by her appearance. He looked at her closely and asked her with a smile how her first lesson went. He wanted to know if she had listened attentively to the teacher. The young lady hugged her father with lightning speed and said with a smile that she had found it very interesting. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he was very busy right now. He smiled and said that it was not quite so, and if she needed something, then it was more important than all other matters. She looked closely at the documents her father was looking at and noticed drawings of different outfits. With lightning speed, Gallagher covered his documents with his hand. She looked at him in surprise but did not answer. A moment later, the young lady told her father that she had a favor to ask of him. The young lady looked at her father with a smile and asked if he could draw something for her. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand what was going on. He smiled and asked if she wanted a cute animal or a flower. Tia looked closely at her father and firmly said that she would like him to draw her grandmother. He looked at her in surprise and did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he said that they had a lot of portraits in their house. He asked his daughter if she needed to show them. Tia was taken aback because she realized that she had made a mistake. She looked at her father and said that in the portraits, her grandmother's face was too stern and her clothes were too luxurious, and it didn't suit her. She smiled and said she wanted to see her grandmother smiling peacefully. She smiled and said she wanted to see her the way he remembered her. The man looked at his daughter in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that at all. For a moment he thought, as he recalled the image of his mother. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, the last time he saw her was a long time ago, so he didn't remember well, but he knew that his mother was a very sensitive and kind person. A moment later, he had drawn a beautiful portrait of his mother. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he was not sure if he had done a good job. Tia froze for a moment when she saw her grandmother's portrait. A moment later, she rolled up the portrait and told her father that she was going to go and play outside for a bit. He looked at her in surprise, as he didn't understand why she was acting like that. The young lady called out to her father with a smile that she would be back soon, And in a hurry, he told his daughter to be careful. She smiled and wondered why she would fall since she was already an adult. She understood that he worried about her too much. But unfortunately, a moment later, everything happened. As her father said, the young lady was furious. She wondered if her father was also a clairvoyant. She knew that in her past life she had stumbled, and then it rolled into the valley of death. She sighed heavily, and she raised her head that she had better be more careful. A moment later, she raised that she was already in place. She knew that behind the estate, there was a small village in which hired craftsmen lived. Unlike the servants who permanently reside in the estate and are given rooms, they live at a distance and are engaged in the production of ordered things for her family. Simply put, this village was created by Rardy for his craftsmen and their families. For a moment, the young lady froze in place. She did not know where to find the person she needed. Tia wondered if she would have to ask everyone she met. A moment later, she noticed that she had scratched herself. She realized that she needed to wash her hands first, because if she got serious early, her father would worry. She looked around as if she wanted to find a well. A moment later, she finally managed to find the well, and in just a few minutes, she walked up to it. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that it was too deep for her. She understood that she could not lift the bucket of water itself because she was weak. A moment later, someone lifted her up. The man looked at her in surprise and asked who she was. The young lady was taken aback and thanked the man for his help. He looked at her in surprise and asked if her parents hadn't taught her to play near the well. The young lady froze in shock as she realized that it was Alfeo Jean himself in front of her. Tia knew that the young man, a genius, a sculptor whose talent was recognized quite late at the age of 30, he was extremely grateful to her family because they, although belatedly, recognized his abilities. And as a sculptor, he dedicated his first creation to their family. Everyone was amazed by his creation. People praised him. The young man used the mastery of dozens of trees. He created a masterpiece of masterpieces, the embodiment of the coat of arms of the world tree, the symbol of the Rardy family. With such a work, he instantly became famous throughout the empire. The young lady was amazed because she was able to find him with ease. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should not be naughty again and should play something safer. Tia looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile. Alfeo looked at her in surprise and said that he was seeing her for the first time. She smiled, and a moment later, she introduced herself. He looked at her intently, as he did not know a girl with that name. He looked closely at her hair and clear skin. He also noticed that she was dressed elegantly and expensively from head to toe. A moment later, he was taken aback as he realized who was in front of him. She smiled and asked for forgiveness for having caused him trouble with the speed of lightning. He bowed and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had made a mistake. She smiled and said that he didn't need to apologize at all because it really was her mistake. Tia looked closely at the young man and asked if his name was Alfeo. He looked at her in surprise and shuddered, saying that it was exactly like that. But he did not understand how she knew. She smiled and said that someone had told her this information. Tia asked with a smile if he really made good sculptures. The young man looked at her with confusion and said that he only carved children's toys out of wood and sold them. He was taken aback and said that, unfortunately, he was not that good at it. She smiled and said that since he was paying for his creation, it meant he was already a master. She smiled and said that his creation was well worth the money. Tia looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had a favor to ask of him. The young lady, with a playful smile, asked if he could make a bust from the painting. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. He hesitated and began to speak, looking at the young lady, who in turn hoped that he would agree. Moments later, he said that unfortunately, it was still difficult for him to make people's faces out of wood. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected to hear anything like that from the master. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, he had made a bust of his family members before she sighed heavily, as she was glad to hear that. He hesitated and began to speak. The young lady was a little puzzled. The young man said sheepishly that he needed a lot of time for this. She sighed heavily because she knew that the teacher had given them a little more than a week, and if the master did not finish it within that time, she would have to come up with something else. He said that from tomorrow, he had a day off, so he should finish it in 4 days. The young lady, in turn, simply wondered if he could somehow read her thoughts. Tia smiled and told him that she would be very happy if he just finished. Tia knew that she needed to quickly give him the job and leave before he said anything else. With lightning speed, Tia handed him the drawing and said with a smile that she was really counting on it as she wanted to give him a gift. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that she would certainly pay him very well for his efforts. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He shouted that he didn't need any payment at all, and everything was fine. She smiled and said that he was working very hard to hone his skills, and any work should be paid for. Tia said with a smile that she was a Rambardi, and she proudly followed the principles of a fair deal, so he should accept her payment. She looked at him intently and said that it was his right. The young master looked at his mistress intently and said that he would certainly do his best. She smiled and said that was very good. She said that she had prepared the right log for him to use. The young lady asked if he could take it. She sighed heavily and said that the log was too heavy and she could not carry it herself. The twins burst into their sister's room with a smile. With lightning speed, they rushed to her, hugging their sister. They asked her to play with them. Marin smiled and said that they could play hide-and-seek or tag, and he also asked what she liked. She sighed heavily and said that she was busy. The twins were outraged. They shouted that she was not at all busy because every day he read books only to her. They said that she was bad young lady. In turn, she was furious. She looked at them intently and said that if they continued to behave like this, she would never play with them. The twins were shocked and they did not expect to hear such a thing from her at all. She looked at them closely and said with a smile that it would be a promise. Tia said that she was really busy now, but later, when she became more free, she would definitely like them. They beamed happily and asked if she really promised this. She smiled and said it was true, and also asked if they would like to make the promise official. A moment later, they said goodbye to their sister with joyful smiles. She sighed heavily as she understood that they would still return tomorrow. She knew they were always pestering her, and the twins rushed to their sister's side like lightning when they saw her on the street. They moved to sit next to her at every meal. They pounced on her with requests to play anytime and anywhere. She was a little puzzled as she did not understand why they behaved so strangely and why they came to her so often. She knew that in her past life, she had been indifferent to them, and after their parents divorced, they stayed with their father, and after they restored the Schultz castle, they behaved as if they had nothing to do with Rambardi. The young lady wondered for a moment why her aunt had divorced her husband. She knew that he loved her aunt very much and even abandoned his castle for her. A moment later, her father burst into the room and called his daughter with a joyful smile. He smiled and said that she should look at the book he had finished, and she, with her lightning speed, adapted to the circumstances. She smiled and asked what he had already written that she found interesting. Gallagher smiled and told his daughter that he had done something that she would really like, and he also asked if she wanted to read it together. The young lady looked at her father with a radiant smile and said that she would not mind reading together. She knew that her father had already written dozens of books. She knew that he had dropped out of the academy and had not really been involved in academic work, and had ended up writing single-volume works that were then sent to languish in the estate's bookcases. She knew that he always looked very happy when he wrote books. She was very interested in what he wrote this time. She froze for a moment as she read that her father had written that he was looking forward to the day when he would choose an outfit for his daughter's debutante ball. He smiled and said that he wanted to finish the book by the time she started wearing adult clothes. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, the book did not shine with depth of text, but with its help, she would be able to find out what styles were popular in the empire, from generation to generation. He smiled and said that fashion tended to come back. He looked closely at his daughter and said with a smile that usually mothers choose the outfits for the debutante ball, but he in turn did everything in the best possible way. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry about it at all. Tia froze in place in surprise. Tears suddenly came over her. She knew that then she was never able to get to the debutante ball. After her father's death, she ceased to exist for everyone, and no one even thought of sending her an invitation. And she herself was completely concentrated on her duties, and there was no concern about her debut in high society. By the time she had managed to achieve any sort of position in the house, The places that connected her with her father had long since been rebuilt, and she no longer had a single book of his left in her hands. Tia thought for a moment, since there was a possibility that you were asking for life. He wrote her the same book, dreaming of the day when he would personally choose her outfit. She looked intently at her father and called out to him. The young lady hugged her father with a smile and said that he was obliged to pick out a dress for her later. Gallagher looked at her in surprise. He smiled and said that, of course, they would choose the outfit together. He said that they would sit down together, open the book wide, and look through everything and choose together. The young lady said with tears in her eyes that they would definitely do it. She very much wanted him to see her debutante ball this time. She wanted to take his hand in the outfit he had chosen and enter the ballroom. A moment later, she pulled away from her father as she heard someone arrive. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand her change. She looked at her father intently and said that they should go for a walk in the garden right now. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand why she was behaving like this. The young lady pulled her father's hand with lightning speed. He was surprised that she wanted to go for a walk so suddenly. She smiled and said that he should quickly follow her because the sun was shining very brightly. He shouted for her to go slower because she might fall. The young lady knew that it was time to prepare a reliable support for her father. Claravon looked closely at the material that was brought to him and asked what raw material the fabric was made of. The man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, he said that they made cloth from the long stems of the croya. He thought about this product for a moment. Vida said with a smile that this raw material was traditionally used in the eastern regions of the empire, and the head of the trading group personally investigated everything about it. Vyedzi looked at the young man with a grin and asked why he was pretending to be an expert in everything when he actually knew nothing. Crichton smiled and said that his ignorance was natural. He smiled and said that, although these were traditional raw materials, they were only used in the eastern regions, and few people knew about this material. But still, people loved new products, and the forecasts for this enterprise were very positive. The Duke listened attentively to everything. The Duke sighed heavily. He understood that in front of him now was a stupid trading group and things unsuitable for trade. He understood that this enterprise was aimed only at bribing the Empress and the approach, but the Empress had enough of it. He saw that his son was trembling with anticipation because he sincerely believed that regardless of the degree of success, it would help him get closer to the Empress. But in case of failure, he would not only suffer losses, but also incur her wrath. The young lady jumped into the cart with lightning speed. She smiled and said that it looked like there was a lot of cloth in the cart. The Duke looked at his granddaughter in surprise, as he did not expect to see her at all. She smiled and greeted her grandfather. Vyedzi looked at the young lady with disdain and said that the adults were working now, so she needed to go and play somewhere else. Tia ran up to the Duke with lightning speed and threw herself into his arms with a smile. The Duke smiled and asked if she had heard his voice and come to him. Tia smiled and said that it was true because she was walking with her dad, and suddenly heard a voice. Vyedzi was shaking with rage on the spot. She looked closely at the Duke and asked with a smile what was in the cart, as she noticed that there was a lot of the same fabric there. The Duke smiled and said that it was all material made from a grass called croy, and they were now wondering if they could make money by selling the fabric. The young lady looked closely at everyone present, because she understood that this was another failure. She knew perfectly well that they didn't even know anything about the features and advantages of the fabric, and in the end, they would be forced to give up everything. Tia knew that her family had to make up for the losses incurred in their past life for a long time. And for some time, they were ridiculed by the merchants. She smiled and reached for the fabric as she wanted to touch it. The Duke excitedly told her to sit quietly and not to move as it was dangerous, and she might fall. She understood perfectly well that no one would listen to her child. Even if she told about all the problems of this deal, she knew who should play this role. Gallagher, breathing heavily, asked his daughter where she ran away from him. She smiled and told her father that her grandfather would sell the fabric. He was taken aback and asked her father for forgiveness. He looked at his daughter and said that adults were talking now, and she should not disturb them. She smiled and told him to look at this fabric. A moment later, the young lady told her father that the cloth was made of grass. She was surprised and did not understand how this cloth could be made of grass. She said it was very amazing. The young man looked at the cloth in surprise. He looked closely at the fabric, as this was the first time he had heard that this herb could be used to make fine fabric. He said that it really was rough to the touch. Vidze glanced sideways at his brother. Gallagher was taken aback, and looking at everyone present asked for forgiveness. He said that he was simply interested in seeing what he had previously only read about in a book. He looked at his daughter and said that it was time for them to go. The young lady was in shock. She understood that they could not just leave. She was puzzled since her brilliant plan to strengthen her father's position failed. The Duke looked at his son intently and told him to tell him everything in more detail. The young man tensed up. He said that he himself did not know much about it. What he knew was that Croy had been used in certain regions of the empire for about 100 years. He sighed heavily and said that it was easy to produce from this material. There was a lot of it, so people were happy to buy such fabric. Croyton was taken aback and asked in surprise about commoners. He looked closely at the young man and asked about the task, but asked if commoners really used such fabric. Gallagher looked at the merchant in surprise and said that it was because the fabric was coarse and rough, so it was not suitable for noble attire. Croyton was shocked. He shouted that this could not be, because the person who told him about this material said that both nobles and commoners wear clothes made from it with pleasure. He was puzzled because he knew that it was impossible to make money on commoners. The Duke looked at the man in surprise and said that his son seemed to have said that he personally inquired about this fabric. Croyton hesitated and said that a very close friend of his did this, and he trusted him as himself. The Duke sighed heavily and told the merchant that it seemed his friend had deceived him. The man was furious because he did not expect such a thing. Gallagher looked closely at the fabric and said it had one drawback. He sighed heavily and said that since the material of plant origin, the fabric has a kind of expiration date. He looked closely at the fabric and noticed damage on it. Gallagher said he knew about it because the material was made from plant stems and was very sensitive to moisture. He said that I had just had a rainy season, and that was the reason the fabric had deteriorated. The merchant was shocked because he had not expected this. He sighed heavily as he didn't know what to do. Now Gallagher looked closely at the man as he understood how offended he was now. Gallagher looked at the man closely and said that Croy is a common herb, so it can be found in the nearby areas. He said that there will be no problem with obtaining materials. Croyton looked at the young man intently. Gallagher smiled and said that was exactly it. Gallagher looked at everyone present and said that he was just suggesting, but if they hoped to make aristocrats their main customers, they might try adding flannel to the fabric. The merchant looked at the young man in surprise, as he did not understand what he was talking about. Gallagher said that the material of Croy was very good. It was light and breathable, and this was a very big plus. He smiled and said that if this material was diluted with flannel, the cost of the product could be significantly reduced, and by spending a little extra money on it, one could save a lot in the future on the main material. Gallagher said they could make the finished product at the same time softer and fresher. Claravan looked at them with a hard look and said that it took skilled craftsmen to work with flannel. He thought for a moment and said that they would have to find a weaver with the right skills. He looked at everyone present and said that they did have weavers' guilds, and there were plenty of craftsmen there. But when adding new fabric, they would need to revise the division of profits based on the amount of each party's contribution to production. A moment later, they began discussing all the nuances of business. Gallagher looked at everyone present and said with a smile that it was now time for him to leave. He said with a smile to his daughter to say goodbye to her grandfather and uncle. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why he was leaving so easily, because he had helped them so much. The Duke looked intently at his departing son and said that he entrusted this enterprise to him. Vidze was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing from his father. He screamed and called the Duke. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that he thought the head of the trading group needed someone knowledgeable in this area. He looked at the merchant and asked what he thought about it. The man with glowing eyes looked at the Duke and said that he was absolutely right, because knowledge about the product was more valuable than anything else. Crichton quickly approached Gallagher and said with a smile that he was very erudite. He said that if he could help them, then they would no longer be afraid of anything. Gallagher hesitated for a moment, since he had never worked in such a field before. The young lady looked at her father closely and asked with a smile if he would really help his uncle. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't just pass up such a chance. She smiled and said that her dad was the best. Gallagher, in turn, froze for a moment in place, from embarrassment. He was overcome by her beautiful smile. Claravon looked at all of us present and said that in that case, they could sign the contract after they rewrote it. Vidze, in turn, was in anger and fury. With the speed of lightning, he left their company. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that her father's knowledge would help neutralize the defect in the fabric. She knew that her uncle would not interfere with the matter. She understood that everyone needed her uncle only because of his position as the eldest son, while Laurels and Gallagher seemed to not exist for them, which is why Vitzi still attended all the receptions at the Imperial Palace on behalf of the family. She knew that he was the heir of the family, always chosen in a fair competition. She understood that if this enterprise became very successful, the invitation from the imperial family next time would come in her father's name. There was someone in the imperial palace whom she really needed to meet as soon as possible. She really wanted to see the second prince. She knew that he should be there. Tia looked closely at the master and said with a smile that it seemed like he was finished. She said that he really tried hard. He smiled and said that it was just a trifle, because the task was from her. She smiled and asked if she could look at the finished work with one eye. He smiled and said that she could do whatever she wanted. The young lady, in turn, slowly lifted the fabric. A moment later, she froze in shock, amazed by the beauty of the creation. He looked at her intently and said that if he needed anything redone or finished, she could just say. So Tia screamed and said that it wasn't so, she was just perfect. She looked at the master intently and thanked him with a joyful smile. He smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for, and also thanked her for giving him such a wonderful chance. He looked at her intently and thanked her with a smile for believing in him. Alfeo sighed heavily and said that he had been very worried all this time. He said that their family business carpentry, and he constantly thought whether he was doing the right thing by spending time on sculpture. He smiled and said that while working on her order, he realized that he really loved it. He said that he is currently replacing his father and working as a carpenter, but when he has a free minute, he spends it on sculpture. He smiled and said that maybe someday in the future, he could really call himself a sculptor. The young man looked at the lady with a happy smile and thanked her. Alfeo said that the words about the value of his sculpture gave him strength. The young lady gave the sculptor his reward. He looked at her in surprise and said that she was giving him too much money. Although he worked as a carpenter in the sweat of his brow on weekends, he did not rest, but carved sculptures. He silently went his way. He could shine brightly at the end of a difficult road. The emperor personally granted him a surname. For this reason, he was reborn as Alfeo Jean. The young lady looked intently at the sculptor and told him to listen to her carefully. She asked him if he wanted to do sculpture, not only on weekends. He looked at her in surprise. She smiled a predatory smile and said that he could do this every day. She knew that thanks to her, he would not have time to learn carpentry. She knew that the evergreen forest that her uncle had gotten rid of in his past life was not just a gift from the emperor, it was a very important place for her grandfather. She knew that her grandmother hated the dreary sight of falling leaves in autumn, and therefore sincerely enjoyed walking with her grandfather along the path of the evergreen forest. Even after she left this world, grandfather would go on their route every day, and he continued to do so until his eyesight became completely clouded and he was bedridden. A moment later, the young lady threw all her thoughts away as she saw her grandfather. He looked at her in surprise. She ran towards her grandfather with a joyful smile. He looked at her in surprise and asked what brought her to him. She smiled and said that she had something for him, so she was waiting for him. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to hear something like this. The young lady said with a smile that he should follow her, and quickly, he said with a soft smile that if she ran like that, she would fall. He looked closely at his granddaughter and asked what was the matter, but a moment later he was taken aback and froze in place. The Duke was surprised he could not utter a word, because he saw a beautiful sculpture. The young lady smiled and told the Duke that she would like to give him a gift. Tia said that her father had painted a portrait of her grandmother, and she asked her friend for a sculpture. The Duke walked silently towards the beautiful carved sculpture, while the young lady in turn watched her grandfather closely. She knew that, in the last years of his life, he had lost his sight, so he was deeply saddened by the fact that he could not even see his grandmother's portrait. But now, even if his sight deteriorated, he would be able to remember her image by touching the bust with his fingertips. The Duke asked his granddaughter in surprise if this gift was really for him. She smiled and said that it was true, and also asked if he liked it. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't just like her. The Duke asked what the price of such a gift was. Tia looked at the Duke intently, as she expected him to immediately recognize the material for the homework. She smiled and asked if he was pleased with her gift. He smiled and said that this gift made him very happy because he has many happy memories of his late wife, so he is filled with happiness when looking at this statue. She looked at him with a smile and said that this was enough, because if he was happy, then she would be too. The young lady understood perfectly well that she would still have plenty of opportunities to prove herself in assignments. And in fact, the purpose of the classes was not to get grades, because she knew that grades alone would not advance her to the position of heir to the family. She understood perfectly well that if she received points from her grandfather, then for the evaluation system, it would not be considered trading at a loss. He looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that according to the rules of etiquette, one cannot simply accept such a wonderful gift. The Duke asked her not to make an ignoramus out of her grandfather. He smiled and asked if she by any chance wanted anything. The young lady thought for a moment. She knew that only a complete layman would ask for money now to do his homework. Tia looked at the Duke intently and said that this sculpture was carved by her friend. She understood perfectly well that now she had a chance to become a link between the hidden genius and the grandfather who valued craftsmanship above all else. The young man looked intently at everyone in the class and said that they could now look at the results of their homework. Clairvon looked at Velisac, shuddered, but did not answer. The teacher sighed heavily and said that the young man had not completed the task. He looked at the twins and asked how they had done the task. Marin said he had sold everything to the servant. Kiliu said he had gotten money for the firewood. They said they had not forced anyone and had sold everything to the man who really needed the firewood. Later, the teacher looked at the young lady and asked how she was doing with her homework. She smiled and said that she made coal out of it and sold it to the blacksmith in the estate. She needed to give some money to the servants who helped her. She looked at the teacher intently and said with a sweet smile that this was the reason she had earned several medics. He smiled and said that it was very admirable. The teacher said that she had produced a special product and sold it here. Yes, where it was definitely in demand. He smiled and said that it was very reasonable of her. The young lady was delighted and thanked the teacher with a smile. Tia looked at the young lady intently, as this was unexpected for her, as she always thought that the girl was very shy and could not be so enterprising. Clairvon looked at the young lady and asked if she had done her homework. She smiled and said that she had done it all. Clairvon looked at her in surprise and asked where her payment was then. The young lady, with a satisfied smile, pointed to the brooch that hung on her clothes and said with a smile that this was her payment. She looked at everyone present and said that she had carved a log into a sculpture and given it as a gift. The recipient was very happy, so he gave her an emerald brooch in return. And of course, the person who had carved it into a sculpture also received a corresponding reward. The young man was shocked. He shouted that it was a lie he did not understand. Who would give such an expensive decoration for some wooden sculpture? He shouted that she simply brought his uncle's brooch and tried to deceive everyone. She looked closely at her brother and said with a satisfied grin that the recipient of the sculpture was her grandfather, and he could ask him. And she looked at the young man intently, as she knew that in his past life he had shouted that she was a half-breed and worthless, as well as useless, and she wanted him to continue to think that way. She knew he would be supplanted by the object of his ridicule, and she wondered what it would be like for him to be gradually stripped of everything he considered rightfully his. The young lady looked at the young man with a satisfied grin, as she understood that this was only the beginning. Clairvon looked at all the children and said that in that case they could finish the lesson for today. Tia screamed and called out to her sister. The young lady looked at her in surprise. Tia ran up to her sister and said with a smile that she had done the task very well. Laurent was taken aback and looking at her sister with embarrassment, said that she had done much better than her, and that her brooch was very magnificent. Tia looked at her sister with a smile, and said that the teacher had said everything correctly, and that she had acted according to the principles of trade. Tia asked her sister if she always read books. She told her sister that she seemed to enjoy studying very much. She admired her sister. The young lady in turn looked at her sister with embarrassment and thanked her. Lorraine is Valeska's sister in her past life, with the help of the Empress. As soon as she reached adulthood, she had to marry an aristocrat who was much older than her. But Lorana, who was then neglected by her own husband, who was even made fun of by the servants, who was turned away by her entire family and relatives whom she trusted, began to wither away before our eyes, and eventually, alone in a strange house, far from her family, she soon withered away completely and returned to the damp earth. A fragile girl crying excitedly and babbling that she didn't want to leave her home. That's how she saw her for the last time. At that time, she considered her an overly refined and weak flower. Tia knew that Lorraine was much wiser than her brother and twins. Tia asked with a smile if she would mind talking to her more. Tia said that this was her second lesson, and she would be very grateful to her sister if she could help her get settled in a little. The young lady in turn looked at her sister in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from her. But a moment later, she agreed to help her sister with a smile. Tia understood perfectly well that this was a good chance to raise another good specialist for the family. She did not want to let her die so senselessly again. Some time later, the young people were sitting at a family gathering. Gallagher burst into the office with lightning speed and apologized for being late. He looked around at everyone present in surprise, as he thought that his father was also already present at the meeting. Shanine sighed heavily and said that the meeting with the person in charge of the bank had dragged on, and that was why his father had not yet arrived. Viedze looked at his brother with anger and said that he was very lucky. Gallagher sighed heavily and said that he promised to be more careful in the future. The young man looked at his brother and said with a smile that he rarely sees him lately. He asked his brother what he was so busy with. Gallagher sighed and timidly said that he was doing the work on behalf of his father. He was puzzled because he knew that it was difficult to call it work, just that sometimes they consulted with him. His brother was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Oh, a moment later, he said that he heard that he had completely stolen his brother's business project. Viedze looked at Laurels with anger and asked if he was laughing at him now. Laurels was taken aback, as he had not expected to hear such a thing at all. He said in surprise that he had not meant anything like that, and he would not dare to do such a thing. Viedze looked at his brother with anger and said that he would tell him everything. Now he told his brother not to be too arrogant, and because he was entrusted with a serious matter once, because next time he would never be so lucky. Gallagher was taken aback and looked at his brother in surprise. He said that he was truly sorry that everything had turned out this way. He said that such thoughts could not even have occurred to him. He said that since he wanted his brother, he would hand over this work to him. Viedze was furious because he understood that his brother wanted to return to him the task that his father personally entrusted to him. He furiously attacked his brother and shouted that he should not dare to look down on him. Shananette looked at them with cold fury and shouted at them to stop. The young men looked at her in surprise. Shananette looked at her brother intently and told him to calm down immediately because their father would be coming to them. Soon she was puzzled that he continued to act like a little child. Viedze in turn shuddered and looked at her with fury. A moment later, he pushed his brother away in a hurry, and he fell with a crash onto the sofa. Laurels looked at his brother in surprise and asked where he was going. Viedze said with fury that his insides were twisted just by looking at his brother, and for this reason he needed to get some fresh air. Laurels in turn rushed with lightning speed to catch up with his brother. Gallagher looked closely at his sister and thanked her. She sighed heavily and said that she was just tired of listening to this noise. He smiled and said that she saved him anyway. She sighed heavily, and while sipping her tea, said that he really was still the same coward. She smiled and said that he was a squirrel. He looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. She sighed heavily and said that he was capable of being ignited with passion, even for such nonsense, but at the slightest thing he would drop everything and avoid you. She said that he simply hid in his hollow, not even trying to fight. He laughed, but did not answer. She sighed heavily and told him to listen to her carefully. Shananeh was completely serious when she said that he would not be able to protect anything by constantly hiding and running away. Shananeh told her brother that she had heard that his little daughter was very smart. She was surprised and did not understand how a cowardly deer could have a daughter who looked like a lion. She said that she was worried that his weak character could destroy the child, Gallagher, in turn became quiet and depressed. He could not answer her. The young lady looked at the twins intently and said that the rules were still the same. They were not to leave the main building, and dangerous or hard to reach places were off limits. The twins looked at their sister with a smile and said that they understood everything. She smiled and said that in that case she would count, and they should hide. She started counting while they were running away. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly in the garden. She was a little puzzled as her legs were very painful. She sighed heavily as she felt a pleasant silence. She knew that she could rest a little longer and then go look for her brothers. A moment later, Ferenzi turned around as she heard someone making noise. She was surprised as she knew that at this hour no one should be here. For a moment she froze in place in surprise as she noticed the young man. She was surprised because she thought that most likely the guest was lost. She looked at him in surprise and said that he wasn't allowed here. But a moment later she froze in place, for she saw him angrily take off his hat and throw it away. She looked at the boy in surprise as she heard all the noise that came from him. She was puzzled and did not know what to do. A moment later, she sighed heavily, realizing that she had better pretend she hadn't seen anything. She wanted to leave this place as soon as possible and go look for the twins. But a moment later, the young man noticed her and shouted. He shouted and told her to stop while calling her a barrel. The young lady looked at him in surprise as he insulted her. He looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that he would give her the lowest a chance to serve him. Looking at the young lady, he said with an arrogant smile that she could see him off. Ferenzi, in turn, was furious. She did not understand what he was allowing himself to do now. Croydon, looking at the Empress, told her about a very erudite young man. He said that Gallagher is the third son of Rardy. He has a timid disposition, but he understands much better than his older brother. The Empress was a little surprised since Rardy had a younger brother who was better than the older one. The man backed away since he unfortunately could not control his speech, and breaking down said such words. The Empress looked at the man with a grin and said that this was very interesting. The man backed away and said that he wanted to say something completely different. The Empress smiled and said that it was very interesting because according to imperial laws, the eldest sons usually become heirs. She was surprised that their family had encouraged competition for such a right, and she understood that other noble houses might follow their example. She sighed heavily and said that her son also had a younger brother, with eyes as red as a rose. She got angry and insulted the boy. She glanced sideways at the merchant, as she had heard him say earlier that the eldest son had a son and a daughter. The Empress asked if Gallagher had a child. Croydon was taken aback and looked at the Empress in surprise, as he had not expected such a question at all. But a moment later, he said that he had a daughter and that she would soon be 8 years old. He said that he had seen her once and that she was a very charming girl. The Empress in turn said with a grin that this was not a bad age. She said that her son had just gone to them today to meet Viedz's son. She smiled and said that she would have to ask him when he returned. She wanted to know if he needed a girlfriend. The young man looked hard at the young lady and said with a grin that he wanted her to pick up his hat and bring it to him first, and then she should escort him to the hardware entrance. She looked at him sharply and refused, sharply saying that she did not want to do it. The young lady was furious as he was very rude. He looked at her intently and told her to hurry up a moment later. He was taken aback as her words reached him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she had just said. She sighed heavily and said that she did not want to do that. She sighed heavily and said that if he got lost, she would take him there, but he should pick up his hat himself. She said that his hat was closer to him. Tia looked at him in surprise and asked why she would suddenly do that. The young man froze in place for a moment, in shock, as he did not expect to hear something like that at all. A moment later, he said angrily that it seemed she was blind. He said that he would certainly pardon her if she would immediately give him his hat. After his words, he looked at her with a haughty smile and insulted her. The young lady was furious. She didn't understand where such people were churned out. She understood that he was an ill-mannered boor. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to do this, and also said that he would have raised her himself. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone scream. She looked closely at the young man as she realized who he was. She heard the maid calling the prince. For a moment, there was dead silence between them. She looked at the young man intently as she realized that now in front of her was the man with whom the fall of their family began. He looked at her with cold fury and mockery and asked if she now realized who was in front of her. She was in shock as she understood that the first prince was standing in front of her. Astana, with a haughty grin, said that now she must bow her head and ask for forgiveness for her behavior, and after that she must obediently do everything she was told. The young lady was furious. She wondered if she was obliged to grovel before him, and because he was a prince, she knew perfectly well who she really was, and she was not obliged to please such ignoramuses. Tia looked at him intently and said that she did not know at all who he was. He froze in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she had no idea who he was. He shouted that she had just heard who he was. The young lady in turn shouted that his hat had rolled away again. He looked at the hat with fury and shouted that he had told her to bring it. She looked at him intently and said that since the hat was so dear to him, he should not have thrown it away at all. In turn, the prince looked at the young lady with fury. She turned around and said that she would not bring it because she was not a servant. Astana shouted furiously after her and insulted her. He was shocked and did not understand how she dared not obey him. The prince shouted for the young lady to stop, but it was all in vain. He was furious and did not understand how she could boldly disregard him. He shouted that if he caught her, he would certainly kill her. The maid ran up to the prince with the speed of lightning and said that it was easy to get lost in such lands. She told him that he should not walk alone at all. The prince in turn looked at her with fury, and a moment later, he slapped her in the face with fury. The maids froze in shock. He looked closely at everyone present and asked where his knights were trembling with fear. His nanny said that they were behind the gate. The prince said that they should go in immediately. His nanny was a little puzzled, as she knew that knights were allowed in the Rardy territory. He looked at her with cold fury and called out. He looked at his nanny and said that everything in the empire belonged to the emperor, and he, in turn, followed immediately after the emperor. He did not understand why he should follow the rules of some family. He looked at them with fury and said that if they understood everything, then they should immediately bring the knights to him. He remembered the young lady looking at him and saying that she would not bring him anything because she was not a servant. He asked with a smirk if she was really so impudent that she dared to ignore his orders. He wanted to see how she would behave after the knights had pinned her down. The twins threw a tantrum at her. They shouted that it was not interesting and not fair. They looked at her in surprise because she had found them too quickly. They said that she had probably been watching them hide. She sighed heavily, but did not answer because she knew that they were hiding almost in plain sight. The young lady looked at them puzzled and said that they could play some more. She was excited because she knew that everything happened because of the prince, because she couldn't do anything else because of the one who avoided him. So she found the brothers quickly. She said that they could only play on the first floor of the main building because there were many places where they could hide. The twins agreed with her with happy smiles. She knew that the first prince would not get into the main building of the estate. The young lady looked at her brothers and said that in that case she would count. But a moment later, she froze in place as she saw the knights. She was surprised as she understood that, judging by their uniform, they were not servants. The twins looked at the knights in surprise, as they knew that they did not have their family's coat of arms on them. The twins asked if they were also playing hide-and-seek, since they looked under all the tables. Tia, in turn, froze in place from shock. She knew that direct blood relatives of their house lived in the main building, and now she saw in front of her people who were searching the estate. They were armed and without their coat of arms on their uniform. A moment later, she saw them staring at her. The young lady was shocked. She realized that the prince was simply mad because he sent imperial knights to their estate. She knew that even if members of the imperial family visited their estate, they could not be accompanied by armed men. The meaning of this ancient vow is clear as day, for the two families declared that they were bound together by more than a simple relationship, ruler and subject, and they designated a mutual right to inviolability, a state of affairs that must be maintained unchanged for the welfare of the empire. She was shocked as she knew that this dinner was now being interrupted by the 10-year-old first prince. The young lady, with her lightning speed, grabbed her brothers by the hands and told them that they had to run. The twins were surprised, as they did not understand what was happening. She shouted to them that there was no time for explanation now, and that they needed to run quickly. She was puzzled and scared, because she understood that now the adults were going against the children. She understood that since they were so uninitiated, they were in for a real headache. She knew that they would definitely not enter the office of the head of the family. She understood that no matter how inadequate we were, they would not allow themselves to do something like that with the speed of lightning. She opened the door but froze in place when she saw the prince. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that this was a very unexpected meeting. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock and surprise. She wondered if he was really sick. She understood that in their estate, the emperor himself had to do everything with an eye on the head of the family. She was shocked because she understood that he was not even the crown prince, but he allowed himself to do something like this. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that he saw that she was no longer as impudent as she had been recently. He asked if she had understood where her place was. He looked at her with contempt and a smirk, and told her to immediately fall on her face, after which he would spare her life if she fell on her knees and begged him for forgiveness. The twins pounced on their sister with lightning speed. They were in shock because they did not know who was in front of them. They did not understand why she had to fall on her knees in front of him. The prince sighed heavily and looked at them intently. A moment later, he ordered his knights to remove the boys. Tia, with the speed of lightning, stood between them and shouted that her brothers should not be touched. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't know about the agreement between the imperial family and Rardy. She glanced sideways at the knights and asked if they really thought they could get away with it when they touched the direct descendants of Rardy in their own house. The knights thought for a moment they did not know what to do. The young lady in turn wondered if she would have to fall on her knees before the prince, but a moment later she noticed her relatives. She realized that she was saved. She knew that no one was going to die here so easily with the speed of lightning. She came closer to the prince. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was doing. He asked in surprise if she really thought that everything would be resolved if she just cried. The young lady in turn sighed heavily because she knew that she was doing everything right. She understood perfectly well that now everything would be resolved. Tia looked at the prince intently, bursting into tears, but at the same time she looked at him with a smirk. He looked at her in surprise because he did not expect such a look. He was puzzled and did not understand how she dared to look down on him. The duke came closer to them in a fury and asked what they were allowing themselves to do in their house. The prince was taken aback and did not expect to see the head of the family for the meet. Shananet, in turn, looked at the knights with cold fury and told them to get out of the way. She walked up to her sons and hugged them tightly. She looked at them closely and asked if they were okay and if they were injured anywhere. They looked at her closely and said that they were fine because their sister had protected them. They said that those scoundrels had intimidated her and told her to fall on her knees before them. Shananet looked closely at her sons and comforted them by telling them that everything would be okay. Shananet looked at her niece and thanked her for such a brave act. She sighed heavily and said that she could imagine how scared the girl was. Tia, shaking with fear, said that everything was fine. Shananet looked at her niece and, wiping away her tears, said that her father had raised her well. Shananet, in turn, looked at the prince with fury. She understood that she could not say such a thing about him. She said that they had received notification of his visit, but she could not think that he would behave in such a way. The prince shouted angrily that this was not so, and that the young lady was simply pretending. The duke looked at the prince with cold fury and asked him if he knew nothing about the promise between the imperial family and Rardy. The prince sighed heavily and said that he knew about it, but this arrangement was many years old. He said that there was not a single place in the empire where an imperial knight could not enter. He said that this rule was outrageous and his father could not leave it. The Duke looked at him intently and said that this agreement was not made by his father, but by Mr. Giovannici. Looking at the prince, the Duke said that the dinner was given by the first emperor and one of his predecessors, and was shocked because the Duke unceremoniously named his father. The Duke looked with anger at everyone present in the prince's entourage. He understood that the prince could have made a mistake, but they had to stop him and not allow this to happen. All the prince's subordinates backed away and asked for forgiveness with one voice. The prince, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. He had not expected anything like this at all. The young lady was astonished as the Duke spoke directly of the prince's ignorance. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that everyone knew that what had happened would be sufficient grounds for action against the imperial family. But he would magnanimously close his eyes to this mistake, citing the fact that the prince was still young and did not know everything. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She was struck by his majesty because he did not bow his head to anyone, even to the imperial family. He did not do this. The prince in turn shouted furiously that it all started because the young lady ignored him. He said that she disobeyed the order to bring him his hat and then mocked him. The nanny slowly approached the prince and told him to calm down, because if the emperor found out about what had happened, it would end badly for him. The prince in turn looked at her with fury. He turned around with lightning speed and shouted in anger that they were all useless creatures. He shouted that they were leaving because he did not wish to remain on the estate a minute longer. The young lady looked after him intently. She understood that he had performed to the very end, but he had failed. A moment later, the Duke looked closely at his granddaughter and called her. She looked at him in surprise as she understood that she would most likely be scolded. She sighed heavily because she understood that she had acted very frivolously, because of her, the twins could suffer. She was puzzled because it only seemed to her that she had won the favor of her grandfather. She sighed heavily and told the Duke that she was listening to him. She was puzzled and did not know what to do or how to get out of this situation. A moment later, the Duke stroked his granddaughter's head, and she cowered as if she expected him to hit her. The Duke looked closely at his granddaughter and said with a smile that she was a good girl because she was not at all obliged to follow the prince's orders. The Duke said that she must remember and know that they were Lombardy, and must remain so. No matter who stood before them, the young lady was in shock. She did not expect this at all. The Duke looked at his daughter and said that it was time for him to go last to the office, and she had to take care of the children. Jeannette looked closely at the Duke and said that she understood everything. Looking at her niece, she said that she must be very shocked by everything that was happening. Jeannette, she told the young lady to go with her. Tia looked at her aunt in surprise, but did everything somehow said. She was surprised because she was praised for what she did. She understood that she did what was right. The knight looked closely at the lady and said that the young lady was sleeping very soundly. Jeannette looked at her niece closely and said that no matter how strong she was, a child is a child. She said that the girl deserves praise for at least not losing her composure in such a situation. Jeannette looked at the knight intently and said that although Gallagher was her younger brother, he could not just enter her bedroom. She asked the knight to lay her on her lady's couch. Gallagher burst into the room with lightning speed and called his daughter. He stood frozen for a moment at the door, and as he saw his sister Jeannette, looked at her brother and told him to be quiet as he might wake his daughter. She sighed heavily and, looking at her brother, said that similar news had caught him in the middle of his work. She said that she originally only wanted to take it to him, since that was how it turned out they could talk a little. He sighed heavily and agreed with his sister. Jeannette looked at her brother closely and said that she understood perfectly well that he was distracted by the sudden responsibilities thrust upon him, but still his daughter was still very young, and at that age she needed to be watched closely. She looked at him intently and asked if a father could allow such a child to be all alone. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her, because he had not thought. He started to speak, but she interrupted him and asked if he was really going to quit the job he was doing to look after his daughter all the time. He looked at her in surprise, as he didn't know how she had read his thoughts. She sighed heavily and said that he was just a pampered youth. She looked at him intently and said that she would ask him only one question. She asked him how long he thought his father would be able to remain in good health. The young man froze for a moment because he did not expect such a question. He was taken aback because he did not understand what she was saying. She looked at her brother closely and said that their older brother was too insatiable. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. She looked at her brother intently and said that if he continued to calmly fall face down and belittle himself like this, then he would still be able to live like this peacefully and quietly for some time. She sighed heavily and said that for now, it was enough for him to only carry out certain assignments. She asked her brother if their older brother would be lenient with his daughter, whom he had previously only insulted. She looked at her brother intently and said that their older brother might think that his daughter was interfering with his plans to get closer to the imperial family. Gallagher froze in place for a moment in shock. She looked at him closely and said that fortunately he was very smart, and his appearance was also quite attractive. She said that if he were to be even a little more active, people would be drawn to him. As she left, she said that while their father was still holding on, he should take advantage of all this and build up his strength. She looked at her brother intently and said that since he was leaving tomorrow, he could send his daughter with her. She said that she didn't have as much work as he did now, and it wouldn't be difficult for her to look after another child. Gallagher was surprised, but he thanked his sister anyway. She smiled and said that there was nothing to thank her for since she was her aunt. Gallagher stared at his daughter, who was sleeping quietly. He sighed heavily and asked her for forgiveness, because he thought that by loving her selflessly, he could replace her mother. But now he realized that the responsibilities of parents are not limited to this. He kissed his daughter tenderly and promised her that he would protect her no matter what. The Empress looked at her son with fury and said that he had not listened to her at all. The prince shuddered, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him sharply and said that she had definitely told him to watch his behavior at Rardy. He bowed low and asked his mother for forgiveness. She looked at him intently and said that after some time he should go to the estate with a gift and an apology. The prince was shocked. He did not expect this at all. The prince began to justify himself, but the Empress grabbed him firmly by the face, and he obeyed her. She looked at him intently and asked if he had been very ashamed today. He sighed heavily and, trembling with fear, said that he was very ashamed. She looked at him intently and asked what had offended him to such an extent. He shook his fists in anger and said that he would become the crown prince and be the head of the empire. The Empress looked at him and asked if they really acted as if they were the masters of the empire. He froze in surprise for a moment. She looked at him intently and said with cold fury that they considered money to be the main power, and they had lost the corresponding respect for the imperial family. She kissed him softly on the forehead and told him to never forget today. She looked at her son intently and said that the girl would regret how disrespectfully she had behaved towards him. The Empress, with a sly grin, said that she would personally take care of this. She looked at the prince with a sly smile and said that he did not need to worry about what happened and only needed to obey her in everything. The prince looked at his mother with a satisfied smile and agreed with her. Clarivan looked at everyone present and said that this would be the end of their lesson for the day. He looked at the children with a smile and said that today there was also homework. He smiled and said that it was not that difficult, although it depends on the persons. The young lady looked at the teacher intently. She realized that he was contradicting himself. He smiled and said that by the next lesson, they should prepare an answer to this question. He looked at them intently and asked with a smile, "What is most precious to a merchant?" Kilyu looked at the teacher hard and said that, of course, it was money. The teacher smiled and said that they could count that. As his answer, he said that they could discuss it again during their next class. The twins looked at their sister and asked if she was not coming with them. Tia smiled and said that she would make a pillow and come to them. They said that she could entrust this to the servants, and they would do everything. She sighed heavily and looked at them with a smile, since she had become thrifty with cheese in her past life. She thought for a moment, since she hadn't seen her brother today. She was glad that they had a very pleasant lesson without the snoring that was bothering them. The young lady looked at her sister intently and said quietly that her brother had gone with their father to the meeting. Tia looked at her sister with a radiant smile, as she knew that her sister was always beautiful, like an angel. She smiled and greeted her sister. Lorraine came closer to her sister and asked what her favorite color was. Tia hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. but after a while she said that her favorite color is red. The young lady looked at her sister with a smile and thanked her for her answer, and also said goodbye to her until the next lesson. Tia was a little surprised. She didn't understand why her sister needed such information with lightning speed. The twins surrounded her. They were surprised that her favorite color was red. She froze in place for a moment, not understanding what was happening at all. While reading the book, she sighed heavily and told her father that her relatives were behaving very strangely. She sighed heavily and said that she had no idea what they had in mind. Gallagher looked at his daughter and said that he understood everything. She looked at her father in surprise, as she did not understand at all what he was talking about. He smiled and told his daughter that her birthday was coming soon. He said that he was just about to ask what gift she wanted to receive. The young lady in turn looked at her father with a smile. Now she realized that when she returned, there was about a month left until her birthday. She was puzzled since a lot had happened recently, and she had completely forgotten about such a day. She looked at her father intently, and with a happy smile said that she wanted a teddy bear. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect it. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't hate stuffed toys and dolls. She sighed heavily as she realized that he had tried it on her, because she blurted out the first thing that came to her mind. She remembered saying she hated them because they moved on their own at night. She said timidly that she thought about it and changed her mind. She smiled and said she just wanted a good book. He smiled and asked what she thought about the horse. The young lady stood frozen in surprise for a moment. Gallagher said with a smile that they could bring her to a 1-year-old child, and she would begin to raise him and be friends with him. And when she became an adult, he would be a wonderful steed for her. She sighed heavily and wondered if such questions could really be resolved so easily. She was puzzled because she knew that in her past life, she died under the hooves of a horse. He smiled and said that they could definitely go horse riding together later. He said that she would look great in a riding outfit. A moment later, he said that since he had started all this, he needed to find out more about it. The lady was taken aback and thanked her father. She looked at him intently and asked if he didn't feel sorry for the child. He looked at her in bewilderment as he didn't understand what she was talking about. She said that he would have to part with his mother, even though he was still very small. And if she were a little foal, she would be very sad. She knew that she would not be sad at all. She just had bad memories associated with horses. She wanted him to give her all the money he would have to spend on keeping one horse. He was surprised, but he looked closely at his daughter. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, he embraced his daughter, and asking for forgiveness, said that her father had not thought of this at all. He said that he would bring the mother horse along with his son. The young lady froze in shock, as she had not expected to hear such a thing from her father. She was puzzled, as she had wanted something completely different. He looked at his daughter and said that she herself had just said that it was cruel for the little foal to be separated from its mother. He smiled a beaming smile and said that for this reason he would buy a horse for Mom too, and they would not have to be separated and they would be happy to live together. She sighed heavily because she understood that his words were true, but a mare that could give birth was worth incomparably more than a foal. Tia sighed heavily because she understood that her father was a real Rardy. She understood that she would not be able to convince her father, and agreed with him. He smiled and said that she was very kind. He looked at her intently and said that they had decided on the gift. The young lady looked at him in surprise. He smiled and said that he did not want to leave her alone now. He looked closely at his daughter, and with a gentle smile asked if she would go with him. She thought he would take her on a picnic. A moment later, he showed the Duke the throws of fabric. He said that this fabric is dyed and light. It breathes very well, and with the onset of summer, the demand will increase. The young lady did not expect that they would go to a business conversation. The Duke sighed heavily and said that there were still a few months left until the end of summer. Tia knew that she had no reason to complain because she had been able to hear about this deal. They discussed the fabric and its production quietly. For some time, the young lady looking closely at the fabric her father had brought. She looked closely at the fabric as she was a little surprised. Her father said that at the moment, the best solution would be to monitor the reaction on the street of costume shops. Because aristocrats are frequent guests there, he said that he was ready to vouch for the quality. Therefore, he believed that they could expect a very positive response. The Duke sighed heavily, as he knew that all they could do was wait. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why she was wasting time waiting when they had already made a good product. She knew that the joint production alone would cause a stir, and she knew that gossip mongers were already anticipating the goods. She glanced sideways at her cup of tea, wondering if there was nothing she could do. But moments later, a brilliant idea came into her head. Some time later, everyone condemned the cooperation of the Rambardi family and the Anginas family. They said that they had great expectations for their cooperation. Everyone was surprised that they were producing textiles. The young people heard that they were going to import new silk from some western region. Vids in turn sat at the reception and listened to all the conversations of the aristocrats. He was furious. He was very angry because he understood perfectly well that it was he who started this enterprise. He was puzzled because the enterprise was taken away from under his nose. The young lady looked at him intently and whispered quietly that people were looking at him now, and he should be quiet. She quietly said that everyone was waiting for him to make a mistake, and that was why they were whispering loudly enough for him to hear everything she asked if he would really fall for such a childish trick and lose face. She looked at him intently and asked with a smirk why they didn't get some fresh air for a little while. Vids in turn shouted with rage. He said that they all knew that he had initiated the enterprise, but they now dared to point out to him what had happened at the reception he had organized. The lady said with a smile that it was time for his brother to repay the family for the food and shelter they had given him. She sighed heavily and said that it was just the production of low-grade fabric. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile what the chances of success were, since this was a fabric that only commoners used. He sighed heavily and said that she was right. Vids in turn said angrily that the head of the trading group was also very stupid. Vids was furious because the head of the trading group wanted to foist something like this on him, and he also tried to bargain. She looked at the young man intently, as he had insulted the Anginas clan in front of her. Since she herself was of that clan, she knew that it was reckless of him. She said that she understood that he had taken a great risk, and now found himself in a very unfortunate situation. She said that his brother was only a younger son who had played the slacker so far, and there was no chance that he would make it big in his first attempt at business. She smiled and said that it would be better to make a better deal with her family as soon as the opportunity came. The young lady in turn looked at her father with a playful smile and said that he should also show her this fabric. Tia reached out and pulled the fabric and accidentally spilled the tea. Gallagher rushed to his daughter's side with lightning speed. He was very worried and asked if she was okay, as he knew that she could easily burn her hands. The young lady smiled a wicked smile and told her father that she was fine. But in turn, she looked closely at this fabric and called her father. She knew that she had succeeded and she had done what she wanted. He looked closely at his daughter and said that they could make the fabric again, as long as she didn't get hurt. The Duke looked closely at his son and called him the young man asked his father for forgiveness. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he would bring a new piece of cloth at once. He looked at the piece of cloth in surprise and asked his father if a whole cup of tea had really been completely absorbed into such a small piece of cloth. The Duke smiled and said that it was exactly like that, and not a single document had even gotten wet. The Duke looked at the piece of fabric with a smile and said that its application could be much wider than he thought. Gallagher said that if the fabric was supplied to the costume department with instructions, it could definitely attract the attention of buyers. The young lady in turn squeezed her father. She was puzzled because this was not what she had wanted at all. She understood that this was not enough. She looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that his fabric had absorbed the things and that it was very surprising. She smiled and asked if people would fight over the fabric if they liked it. He smiled and said he didn't know if it would be exactly as she said, but it would be great if it did. She looked at him in surprise and asked if other people didn't like the fabric. He smiled and said that it wasn't that simple. He made it for the first time, and that's why few people know about it yet. She looked at her father closely, as she knew he was thinking in the right direction, and that was the whole point. She smiled and thought for a moment, later said that if someone tried it, others would definitely want it. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she had just said. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was true. And if now someone felt at least once how unusual and soft she was, then anyone would want to touch her again. She knew that it was impossible to predict the reaction to the product when it was all put on the market. She understood perfectly well that it was also impossible to suddenly reduce the number of working fabrics. And while waiting for the fact that people in general would learn about the product, it would be necessary to somehow pay the weavers themselves. The products would not be bought, but would continue to be produced, which would lead to an increase in its stocks in warehouses and an increase in the cost of storing it. She knew it was better to advertise in advance with the product already in hand. He thought for a moment and said that they could try it now because the material was amazing, and so it would be very good if people could touch it in advance. The Duke looked at his son closely and said that this was a very good option. He looked at his son closely and asked why they didn't choose aristocrats who would be the main clients and give them something from this material. Gallagher looked at his father and said that there was very little time left before sales began, and if they wanted to make it, they needed to do something very simple. The young lady in turn realized that now was the time for her to speak. She looked intently at her father, and with a playful smile said that he could make her a handkerchief. He looked at her in surprise, but she was not at a loss, and said with a smile that he could make her a very small scarf, decorated with flowers in the corners. She said that it should turn out very beautiful, and she would brag about it. The Duke smiled and said that this could be a good example, since it would not take much effort and time, and no special pattern was needed, either since they only needed to cut out a piece of fabric. Gallagher looked at everyone with a smile and said that simple decoration should include embroidery or something, but a moment later, he said that unfortunately, not everyone wears scarves. He looked at his daughter intently and said with a smile that they needed to write everything down. Carefully, the young lady in turn looked at her father intently. She knew that he would definitely succeed. In a rush, he said that there was no time to waste. Now he knew he had to discuss this quickly with the head of the trading group. Gallagher looked at his father closely and asked if he could take his daughter home. The Duke smiled and said he would take her home. He said his son didn't need to worry at all and could go about his business. The young lady in turn wished her father good luck with a smile. The Duke looked at his granddaughter with a smile and asked if she would like to have dinner with him today. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing at all. A moment later, the young lady said with a smile that she did not mind, and she would like to taste the meat. Some time later, the young lady was having dinner with the Duke, and he smiled and said that she should eat well in order to grow up faster. The young lady in turn knew very well that their personal chef cooked very tasty food. But today, she did not expect that there would be such delicious food on her table. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he too should eat a lot. He smiled and said that he was quite full just by watching her eat well. The Duke looked intently at his granddaughter and called her. He smiled and asked if she wanted anything special. Tia looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. A moment later, she realized that he was probably talking about her birthday present. He smiled and said that he had heard earlier that she loved to read. He asked if she would mind a small library. The young lady looked at him with a smile. She was surprised, but also delighted. But a moment later, she understood his words and asked in surprise what he was talking about. She was very puzzled because she knew that this was too much. The Duke smiled and said that it was his youngest granddaughter's birthday, and he couldn't just let it go. She smiled and asked if it was really going to be her personal library. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that if she wanted it, then so it would be. She thought for a moment, as she knew that it wasn't a bad suggestion at all, due to the fact that she was taken to her aunt's. Every time her father was away on business, she had neither the space nor the time to be alone and get her thoughts in order. She smiled and said that a personal library was a very wonderful offer, but she wanted something different for her birthday. The Duke looked at his girlfriend in surprise, and smiling asked what she wanted. The young lady smiled and said it was a mere trifle. Tia smiled and asked if he could promise to fulfill one request of hers one day. The Duke in turn looked at his young granddaughter in surprise. He did not understand what request was being discussed. A moment later, he looked at her intently and laughed wildly. The young lady in turn knew that in a little while something would happen that she would not be able to cope with without her grandfather's strength. She knew that if the Duke refused her now, then she would have to find another way she wanted to force and listen to her once, because the matter was very serious. The Duke asked if she understood that he would now ask about a gift greater than just a library. She looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if this was true. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face, but did not answer. The young lady sighed heavily. She thought she had gone a little too far. But a moment later, the Duke said with a radiant smile that they had agreed. Tia looked at her grandfather with a smile and thanked him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really that happy about it. She smiled and said that, of course she was. She was very happy because now she had a weapon for that day, and all she had to do was wait. And she also knew that she needed to prepare as much as possible. Gallagher thought for a moment as he sat in his office. He knew that the merchant should have heard the result by now. He was puzzled and wondered why the head of the trading group had not arrived yet. He was excited and wondering if the reaction of the people was bad. The man flew into the office with lightning speed and with a joyful smile shouted that they had succeeded because the sales had not yet begun, but orders were already pouring in. He looked closely at the young man and shouted with a joyful smile that a whole mass of orders had rained down on them. Gallagher looked at him in surprise as he had not expected such a thing. A moment later, he sat down on the sofa with a thud, feeling relieved. Croyton looked at the young man with a smile and said that he was a great pretender. Croyton said with a happy smile that he still needs to continue to develop in business. Croyton came up to the cupboard with lightning speed. He said with a joyful smile that somewhere in the cupboard there was a bottle that he had hidden for a lucky day. A moment later, they were drinking wine to celebrate the successful start. Croyton sipping his wine with a happy smile, saying that he hadn't meant to ask before. He looked at his companion closely and asked what had prompted him to change his plan halfway through, since the specimen was a simple handkerchief, but it was enough to cause a stir. Croyton looked intently at his companion, and with a joyful smile said that he was not saying this as a reproach to him, he was simply admiring him. He said they had been busy with the product launch just days away, but now they are getting orders from places other than costume shops and boutiques. Croyton looked at the young man with a smile and said that their external success on the telecom was his merit. Gallagher in turn laughed, but said nothing. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that it was nothing special. He suddenly thought for a moment and remembered his sister's words. She had told him earlier that he would not be able to protect anything by constantly hiding and running away. She had said that while their father was still alive, he should take advantage of this and build up his strength. Gallagher now understood perfectly well that he had to acquire influence for the sake of his daughter. He did not want his daughter to go through injustice. He wanted her to be able to live in peace. Croyton looked at the young man with a smile and said that he expected nothing less from Rardy. He looked hard at his companion and said that, although they had drunk to success, the real work was only just beginning. Since the number of orders was huge, they had to try to ensure that the goods were delivered without a hitch. Gallagher sighed heavily and said that he had just wanted to say something regarding this. The man looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Gallagher sighed heavily and, looking into the distance, said that since production had already been established, he would like to step down from the leading position of the enterprise. The man froze in shock on the spot because he did not expect this. Croyton pounced on his companion with questions, shouting that all the hard work was already done, and all that was left was to reap the rewards. Gallagher said, with a smile, that it was enough for him to set up the process once. He said with a smile that it would not be difficult for him to keep the business afloat. Gallagher said that, unfortunately, he had a business that he wanted to take over. The man looked at the young man in surprise, as he was surprised that he wanted to start a business. Gallagher said with a smile that he was going to promote this enterprise in his own name and with his own funds, and not from the Rardy trading group. The man froze in surprise, as he did not expect this. Gallagher was well aware that if he could create as many things as possible under his name, it would then become a solid support for his daughter, so he could not be content with the current situation as it had been until now. He understood perfectly well that he simply had to provide his daughter with a stable future with everything he could. Croyton looked at the young man closely and asked if it was because he was too young. He said that youthful maximalism was in its prime now. He smiled and said that he understood everything, but in exchange, Gallagher at least hint at what kind of enterprise this was, so that the situation would become a little clearer. He told the young man with a smile that since this was the business he was promoting, he would be happy to invest. The man understood perfectly well that the Duke's sons were very talkative, but he did not understand why such a bright mind was hiding all this time. With lightning speed, he topped up his companion's wine. At first, the man was upset, considering him overly cautious, but now he saw that he had inherited his father's courage and determination. He looked at the young man with a smile and offered him a drink to the prosperity of his enterprise. Croydon also wished him success in his new endeavor, and Gallagher thanked him with a smile. Croydon looked closely at the young man. He understood that the young man would one day achieve great heights. He wanted to put in a good word for him. With the Empress, he wanted to advise the Empress to take a closer look at the young man. Gallagher looked closely at the glass of wine, as the drink was indeed bitter. The young lady greeted all the servants passing by with a radiant smile. The maid asked with a smile where she was going. Tia returned and said that she was going to the doctor. She smiled and said that they would have tea together. Looking at the young lady, the maid asked to help her with the box. She smiled and said that there was no need for that because she had strong hands. After a few days of bustle, as word spread of the great success of her father's enterprise, the servants' attitude towards her began to change noticeably. Tia was a little surprised as she saw that they had become much more polite and friendly than before. Now she understood that this was where strength was manifested. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was her father's power, and she could not call it her own. She understood perfectly well that the position of mistress of the clan that she was going to receive was much higher. Tia understood perfectly well that in order for Togo to calmly achieve a high goal, she needed to prepare everything down to the smallest detail. A moment later, she entered Asteri's office, the young lady in turn perfectly understanding that the time had already come for careful preparation. Tia greeted Esteru with a joyful smile. Estira looked at the young lady with a sweet smile. Ferenzi only said that today she brought fruitcake for dessert. Estera in turn was very happy. Some time later, they were drinking tea and eating cake. Tia looked closely at the young girl. She knew that despite the fact that she was modest and meek, she was extremely cautious. Tia had to work very hard even on her easy plan, so that Estere was eventually entrusted with treating her wrist, and they became close. In any case, she knew that she was very lucky, because the young lady turned out to have a terrible sweet tooth. Tia knew that on her meager salary, the young lady could barely afford cookies, let alone varieties. So Tia firmly seized on this trait of the young lady. Tia looked at her new friend with a smile and said that she had brought another cake so she could take it with her. Estira was very surprised because she could not accept such gifts from the young ladies every time. Tia looked at her friend with a smile and said that in return, she would participate in her tea party every time. The young lady in turn was very glad that her friend had such a trait, because she could take advantage of it with the help of her family's wealth. Estira looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if it was okay to pour her wrists. The young lady smiled and said that she was fine, and her arm had been completely healed for a week. She smiled and said that she was fine. Estira looked closely at the young lady and said that she had recently injured an area of the joint that needed to be especially careful with. She sighed heavily and said that if she hurt him once, he would become weak, which would cause her to hurt herself even more the next time, and it would be very painful. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not want to listen to her long dialogue at all. The lady understood perfectly well that since her new friend was so meticulous and correct, she would definitely invent a cure. She smiled and said that she could hold a cup with both hands. Tia looked at her closely and said with a smile that if she got hurt again, Estira would temporarily heal her again. Estira in turn was shocked by the words of the young lady, but a moment later, looking at the young lady, she shouted that for this reason she did not care about her hand. The young lady in turn decided to quickly change the subject of the conversation. She told her friend that she was now drinking the most delicious tea. Estira sighed heavily as she understood that she could not do anything with the young lady. Tia looked closely at the girl as she understood that now the atmosphere was already conducive to conversation. Tia looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she had a dream. Estira was taken aback for a moment as she did not expect to hear such a question. But a moment later, the young lady sighed heavily and said with a smile that she dreamed of entering the academy and studying medical botany. Tia, in turn, looked at the girl in surprise, but she mentally wondered if she should say that she had assumed, so she realized that her new friend had already had such a plan in mind at about this time. Tia looked at her in surprise and asked if she didn't want to go to the most expensive academy. Istira smiled and said that for this reason she was saving money, and if she collected the amount for at least 1 year of study, she could aim for a scholarship later. Tia looked at her closely and asked how much money she had saved up. Now she understood perfectly well that the academy was originally founded in the imperial palace. She had heard that it was possible to enter the academy regardless of class. The main thing was to have a head on your shoulders. But unfortunately, the tuition fees were incredibly high, so now it is effectively a specialized educational institution for aristocrats. The young lady hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to answer this question. A moment later, she said that she had collected about half, and the young lady in turn was taken aback, as she understood that Astira was diligently saving penny by penny. She smiled and said that it was incredible, and she only had a little left to save Tia. Understood perfectly well that it was very surprising that with her grant she was able to save at least half. She understood that the girl's persistence was simply amazing. Tia looked at her closely and asked with a smile what she wanted to do after she learned all the medicinal herbs in the academy. Astira said with a smile that after she studied medical botany more thoroughly, she wanted to find a way to treat the poor herself, and she also really wanted to build a hospital that they could go to. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that this was her dream. Tia looked closely at the young girl and asked how she could help her. Estera looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to talk about the Rardy scholarship. Now Tia looked at her closely as she realized that she was indeed smart. The young lady looked at her with a smile and said that she was still little. Tia looked at the girl with a predatory gaze and said that she would like Estira not to forget that she is also a full-fledged Rardy. Estira in turn shuddered as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady understood perfectly well that even without taking into account the scholarship, the money to send one person to the Imperial Academy, for her family, was just pennies. She could cover this amount with her own pocket money in a couple of months. She understood that the money was already dripping into her bank account. She looked closely at the girl and asked what she thought about this. Estira smiled and said to the lady that she could not believe that she was very small. She asked the lady how she could be useful to her. Tia looked at the girl closely. She was amazed by her resourcefulness. For this reason, she knew that she could rely on her. The young lady said with a smile that she just wanted to help her, and she believed in her. Tia smiled and told her new friend that she didn't have to worry about paying at all. Tia told her friend that if she really felt that bad, then she could give her a special gift in a few days since her birthday was coming up. Estira looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand what was being discussed. Tia smiled and said that she did not need anything special, but she could make the milk and medicine as thick and concentrated as possible. She said that the volume had to be small, so that it would fit in a small flask, and she had to make everything so that the medicine would be enough for daily use for a month. Estira thought about the young lady's words for a moment. A moment later, she looked at the young lady closely and said that she was speaking in such words as if she was asking for medicine, not for herself. Tia smiled and said that if it were for her, she would just ask for a little bit to be prepared for her every day. Estera looked intently at the young lady but did not answer. She sighed heavily and said that she could prepare such a medicine because it could not harm anyone. Tia looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really afraid that she would entrust her with such a dirty business. Tia looked at the young girl with a smile and told her not to worry so much. The medicine Melkon is a unique food supplement that is suitable for any gender and age. It had one not very well-known effect if taken for a long time, and regularly it neutralizes most of the commonly taken poisons. She looked intently at the young lady but said nothing. Tia smiled and asked Astir to make the medicine as thick as possible. She smiled and said that she was counting on her. The young lady in turn knew that her medicine would not be used for harm, but for salvation. The young lady in turn shuddered and was taken aback as she heard someone calling her. The teacher looked at her intently and called her. He sighed heavily and looking at the young lady, said that he had just asked her what her opinion was of what Madame Laurent had said. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She was very deep in her thoughts and forgot that there was a lesson. She looked at the teacher intently and said with a smile that she thought her sister was right. The teacher looked at her closely and asked if he should assume that from her homework she had come to the same conclusion as her sister. She sighed heavily and said that this was not the case, and her opinion was similar but slightly different. She looked at the teacher intently and said with a smile that she thought the most important thing for trading was people. She understood that the enterprise that her uncle had wanted to take up earlier had failed and had been replaced by her father, and she understood perfectly well that she should not say that the result had changed only because of the man. She smiled and said that no matter how capable a person is, he cannot do everything alone, so the more money, the more expensive it is to sponsor people who can be trusted and entrusted with the work. This concerned not only business, but also the politics of the family's governance. Members of the imperial family married influential aristocrats and created blood ties. The duke cultivated specialists by managing a system of grants, and in the end, both were done to obtain people. However, blood relatives also put spokes in each other's wheels, depending on the situation. Some of the Lombardy scholars, after completing their studies, happily went to other homes where they were promised better conditions. After all, depending on the situation, opinions can change as much as you like. The young lady in turn wanted not only money, but also those people whom she could call her own. She knew that she should be able to give them what they needed most. She knew that she would do everything to make sure that they remained only hers. She looked at the teacher with a smile and said that she thought exactly that way. He thought for a moment and said that her answer was quite reasonable. She smiled and thanked him. She knew that the one who had been on the list to hire at the top spot since her return was now standing right in front of her. She looked at the teacher intently because she thought that it would be very difficult for her to find an approach to him and understand his thoughts. But now she seems to understand him, and she knew that she was smart, sweet, and well-mannered. In fact, he liked her very much. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that today was a special day and they could finish the lesson. The twins looked at the teacher with a happy smile and cried out. They were glad that the lesson was over. He looked at them intently and said with a smile on his face that they would see each other again at the banquet. The twins with the speed of lightning grabbed the young lady by the hands and told her that she must quickly come with them. They wanted to eat sweets. Tia looked closely at the twins. She saw that they were very excited. She knew that there was nothing to worry about because she herself was in a good mood today. The twins looked closely at their sister and smiled as they congratulated her on her birthday. She looked at them with a joyful smile. She was not theirs because she knew that everything was correct, and today was her 8th birthday. Sometime later, they came to the banquet. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise on the spot. She sighed heavily as she had the strange feeling again that in her past life it was her 8th birthday and not a quiet one spent with her father. She sighed heavily because she knew that she had worked hard since her return, and now she could see how everything was changing. A moment later, she turned around and looked intently at her sister, who had called her Lorraine, looked at the birthday girl with a smile, and congratulated her on her birthday. Lorraine took her sister by the hand and said that they were already expected, and it was time for them to approach their relatives. Tia was a little worried and confused, as she did not know how they would get through the crowd of people. But a moment later, everyone parted for them, and they walked with ease along the clear passage. They walked slowly towards their elders, and everyone whispered behind their backs. A moment later, those present saw the hero of the occasion. The young lady was well aware that this was a given for their family. They spontaneously attracted attention and confidently enjoyed the privileges. Even if they were still small children, they were still direct descendants. A moment later, the young lady noticed her relatives in the distance. Tia knew that in front of her were direct representatives of the current generation of the family. Lorraine ran to her father with lightning speed and called him. Tia sighed heavily because she knew that whatever the true appearance now, together, they all seemed sincere and open. She looked at everyone present in surprise, as she did not understand where her father was. The Duke looked intently at his knight. She rushed into the Duke's arms with lightning speed and the Duke in turn looked at his granddaughter with a smile. He looked at her closely and asked her with a smile if she was enjoying her birthday party. She smiled and said that she was enjoying it very much and that she had no idea that so many people would come. The Duke smiled and said that everything was correct because her grandfather had invited all his friends. He said that since it was her birthday, everyone had come to celebrate and congratulate her. The young lady hugged the Duke with a smile and said that she would have to thank everyone later. The rest of it looked like the young lady could see that the clothes of all those gathered were of very high quality, which meant that most of them were high-ranking aristocrats with very influential families. The status of being able to receive an invitation on behalf of her family, the very place to which the holders of these invitations happily arrived, all this reinforces her status as a Rambardi's. She sighed heavily as she understood that everyone gathered was only because of the Duke. But now it was enough for her that a huge number of people knew her name. The young lady looked intently at her grandfather and asked where her father was. The Duke sighed heavily and, lowering his nightgown to the ground, said that unfortunately he was a little late at work. The Duke smiled and said that her father said that he really needed to check the fabric workshop, but he would be here soon. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything. Tia said with a smile that it was okay. Even if he was a little late, she would like her father to come dressed up like everyone else, because today was her holiday. The Duke looked at his granddaughter with a smile and said that he would immediately pass this on to his servant. He looked closely at everyone present and said that since the main heroine of the celebration had come, they could begin the banquet. A moment later, they heard a noise in the distance. All the guests froze for a moment. The young lady in turn turned around as she did not understand what the noise was. A moment later, she froze in shock as she saw the prince with a smirk on his face. The prince walked up to the young lady with lightning speed and kissed her hand with a smile. He said with a grin that he had come to see her personally today. He looked intently at the young lady, holding her hand, and said that he would like to congratulate her personally on her birthday. Tia froze in surprise. She felt uneasy, and she did not understand what he forgot at her party. The Duke looked at the young prince in surprise. He in turn did not expect at all that the prince himself would visit them. The young lady moved away from the prince with lightning speed and ran up to the Duke. She was surprised because she knew that last time he was shaking with anger when he left, and she was sure that he would never come to them again. She looked at the prince intently, wondering what he was really up to, and the prince bowed politely and said that his mother had clearly explained his mistake to him that day when he returned to the palace. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he decided to take the chance to apologize. Tia was a little surprised that the Empress herself intervened in their conflict. She knew that technically this party was to celebrate her birthday, but since it was a ball opening on behalf of her family, the Empress could not help but know that there would be a great many people present, and she understood that the Empress intended to make the prince apologize to a large number of witnesses. She thought he was a complete idiot, but now she realized that he could be her opponent, and a much more difficult one than she had imagined. A moment later, the man approached the prince and said that he had brought his gift. The prince smiled and said that everything was correct. A moment later, the prince, with a beaming smile, presented the young lady with an exquisite gift and congratulated her on her birthday. She was puzzled, but with a smile, she thanked the prince for such a generous gift. The young lady sighed heavily, since she really didn't want to accept his gift at all. The prince smiled and said that he was very glad to see how pleased she was with the gift that his mother had personally chosen. He smiled and asked if he could personally put it around her neck as a congratulation. She laughed as she knew he was very perceptive. Everyone present was whispering because the prince had brought a very expensive gift from the Empress. They said that their joint venture had clearly been very successful, and the imperial family was literally accepting the third son and his daughter. The young lady was in a state of rage and did not understand why everything was happening this way. She understood that the Empress had turned her birthday party into a scene of political play and bragging about her fortune. The Duke looked closely at his granddaughter. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the unexpected guest had delayed the proceedings somewhat. He looked at everyone present with a smile and said that he could no longer keep the guests who had honored them with their presence waiting. He smiled and said that they could begin the ball and also suggested raising their glasses. A moment later, all the guests congratulated the young birthday girl. The Duke looked at his granddaughter and said with a smile that she should not stand in one place. Because she could eat something, he said that he asked the cook to try especially hard on her birthday. The young lady looked at the Duke intently, as if she realized that he had noticed her despondency and had deliberately changed the subject. She sighed heavily, knowing that she didn't need to dwell on it. She could just put the necklace away, and that would be it. She knew that now, for the first time in a long time, she could have a good rest simply by ignoring the prince. The young lady turned around and looked at the man in surprise. She didn't understand why he was following her. She looked at him intently and asked if he was stalking her. He smiled and said that she didn't need to pay attention to him at all, because he wasn't acting like that out of a desire to be with her. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that he would be back home in a little while. He said that she should shut her mouth and behave herself. The young lady, in turn, could barely contain her rage. She looked at him intently and asked what he was talking about. She was furious as she understood that this was another decree of the Empress. She wondered if he really thought that she would allow herself to be pushed around. The young lady apologized and said that she was going to play with her cousins, and she had no time for him at all. She looked at the prince intently and said that he could find someone else as a playmate reverently, after which her brothers approached them. Velisac looked closely at the prince and said that he was very sorry that last time they did not have time to really get to know each other. Because of the scandal, he smiled and told the prince that today they could show him the estate. The prince thought for a moment and said that he was not sorry at all. The young man smiled. He was very surprised and did not know what to answer. The young lady in turn was shocked. She knew that the boy was usually stubborn as a ram, but in front of the prince, he became a meek lamb. The prince walked up to the young lady in a rage and took her hand. He pulled her closer to him and said that she was indeed impudent and rude, but even she was better than them. Tia froze in place in shock. She looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Velisac was taken aback and looked at the prince in surprise. He was furious and mentally screamed that he didn't care about the prince's confession. He didn't understand why the prince now looked like this made him a hero. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't understand why her brother was looking at her like that. After all, it was the prince who said everything, not her. She was furious because she understood that the prince was now directing his anger according to the principle that the weaker one is to blame. Shenanit slowly walked up to her niece and asked what she was doing. She looked at her niece intently and said that it was time for her to go open presents since she was the hero of the occasion today. Tia, in turn, was very glad that her aunt saved her. She looked sideways at the prince with a satisfied smile, said that she had completely forgotten about it. She quickly told the prince that she had things to do, so she was leaving. Astana was shocked. He looked at her in surprise and shouted for her to stop. With lightning speed, the young man grabbed the prince by the arms. He looked at them in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. He screamed furiously for them to let him go immediately, but it was all in vain. Everyone looked at the children with a smile, as they understood that they had a very warm relationship. The young lady, in turn, was a little surprised as she understood that the impudence and brute force of her brothers could be useful. Tia sighed heavily as she felt a little embarrassed in front of such a huge number of people, but still decided not to pay attention to it. The twins smiled and said that she should open their gifts first. Tia, in turn, understood perfectly well that if she could thus break away from the prince, then she would accept all the gifts with a joyful smile. Her brothers and sister showered her with various gifts. Everyone present looked at the children with a smile, because they understood that the next generation looked very friendly. Tia accepted their gifts with a joyful smile. At first it irritated her a lot, but it turned out to be more interesting than she thought. Little Craney also brought the young birthday girl a gift and congratulated her with a smile. She smiled and said that now she would open the gift from him. In front of her now stood Astalio's younger brother. Maybe it was because he was still very young, but she was pleased to see that he was still very pure and innocent. She began to open his gift with a smile, but a moment later she was taken aback and froze in place as she heard her father's voice. She froze in shock when she saw her father in all his glory. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to her father, hugging him. She said that he was very handsome. He asked for forgiveness for keeping her waiting. The Duke told his son that he was late. He sighed heavily and asked his father for forgiveness because he tried to come as quickly as possible. The Duke sighed heavily and said that now everyone was definitely gathered so they could go. A moment later, Gallagher was taken aback and froze in place as he heard someone calling him. He turned around and saw the first prince, who was beaming with a radiant smile. The prince smiled and asked the man for forgiveness and said that he had something to tell him. The Duke looked at the prince in surprise. He looked at the prince intently and said that if this was Tia's gift, then he had already given it to her. The prince looked at everyone present with a grin and said that this was not so slowly picked up, the envelope. Everyone froze in place in surprise as they noticed the purple envelope. Vidze was taken aback and looked closely at the envelope as he knew very well who could hand over an envelope of that color. The prince looked at the man with a smile and said that the Empress asked him to convey an invitation to a dinner party that would soon take place. The prince looked at the man intently and said that he would very much like him to honor them with his presence. The young lady in turn was surprised, but at the same time very happy. She knew that this day was already near, the day when she would be able to walk with her ease into the palace and meet Prince Ferris. Some time later, Shannonette was teaching her niece a beautiful curtsy. The young lady was puzzled as she was in pain all over. A moment later, she fell to the ground from exhaustion after hearing praise from her aunt. She was puzzled because it was very difficult for her. Shannonette looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was doing everything slowly now, and that was why it was difficult for her. A moment later, she explained everything to her in great detail and showed her by her own example. The young lady, in turn, was amazed by the beauty and grace of her movements. She looked at her aunt intently and said with admiration that she was very elegant and it was simply amazing. She did not understand how her aunt managed to be so perfect. Shannonette looked at her niece with a smile and said that it was just long practice. The young lady sighed heavily. Shannonette looked at her with a smile and said that it was true. She looked closely at her niece and said that she was still too small and therefore did not have enough strength. She told her niece to practice more, and then her body would obey her. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that, after returning, she really tried to fix everything, ate, and slept well. However, no matter how much she did not gain weight at all. She understood perfectly well that she took after her father in her nature. The twins looked at their mother, and sighing heavily, asked how much longer she would torment their sister because they wanted to play with her. She sighed heavily, as she understood that her brothers promised to sit quietly and wait until the end of the lesson. The twins were shouting that they were bored and tedious. The lady smiled, looking at her aunt, and said that she would practice. She understood perfectly well that she had to master such things perfectly so as not to become a laughingstock in front of the Emperor and Empress. She did not want the prince to make fun of her at all. Shannonette sighed heavily and looked closely at her niece. She looked at her with a gentle smile and stroked her head. Shannonette said that she would like to have a daughter like her. She sighed heavily and said that somehow she became a mother to mischievous twins. The young lady smiled and said that she could just see her more often. Tia looked closely at her aunt and wanted to say something, but suddenly her aunt's husband burst into the room. The twins jumped up with the speed of lightning and looked at their father in surprise. With lightning speed, the twins rushed towards their father and almost knocked him down. They shouted that he was early today and therefore could play with them. He sighed heavily as he knew that they were just school children. Shannonette looked at her husband closely and said that he was very early today. He slowly walked closer to her and kissed her on the cheek with a gentle smile. He said that today, fortunately, there was almost no work, so he came back. The young lady in turn looked at them intently. She saw that there was love all around and they had an ideal family. She was able to see in this house so much more normal and warm relations between spouses. The man looked closely at the young lady and with a smile asked if everything was okay with her. Tia looked at her uncle with a smile and greeted him. He smiled and apologized for not being able to come to her birthday party as he had a lot of work. She smiled and said that she received his gift and was very pleased. Bastian Schultz, the man who had willingly come to their house as a sidekick out of love for his wife, smiled and said that she was very generous and he would certainly send something better on her next birthday. She knew that even though he was not of their house, He was responsible for several small businesses of the family and managed them successfully. Everyone considered him more than capable. Bestian glanced sideways at his wife and called her. He looked at his wife with a tender smile and hugged her and asked if they should have a beautiful girl like their niece Shenanette, was taken aback for a moment and froze in embarrassment. The young lady in turn looked at them intently and said with a smile that it was time for her to go. As she left, the young lady glanced sideways at their happy family. She was puzzled and did not understand why a couple with such a warm relationship would divorce after a few years. Ferenthia looked at Astera intently and asked if the medicine was completely ready. Astera said that it was ready and she had finished it a few days ago. She looked at the young lady in surprise as she had asked her to bring the medicine today. Tia said with a smile that it was exactly like that and thanked her for her work. She said that the medicine could be put in her pocket and no one would know what kind of liquid it was. Astera looked intently at the young lady and, asking for forgiveness, asked if she could ask her a question. Astera looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was planning to use this medicine as an antidote. Tia flinched as she didn't expect to hear such a thing. She hesitated. Looking at the girl, Tia understood perfectly well that now in front of her, she saw a look filled with sincere concern for her. She looked at her intently and said with a smile that this medicine was not for her. Astera was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise. She was very worried. Tia told her friend that unfortunately, she could not say anything more. She sighed heavily and said that she really planned to bring the medicine to the Imperial Palace. She said that the medicine given to her should be given to someone who really needed it. Astera looked at the young lady closely and said that it didn't bother her. It was just that she felt like the young mistress was planning to do something too serious for her age, which was what really bothered her. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile and said that she understood that she was worried about her. Tia smiled and said that she would be as careful as possible. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she had promised to help make her dream come true. Tia smiled and said that she had to keep her promise to Astera, since that was not what she wanted to say at all. The young lady looked closely at her friend and with a smile said that as soon as the time came, she would hide nothing from her and would tell her everything so that she would not worry in vain. Tia smiled and told her that she had made the medicine, and for that reason, she had every right to know about everything. She looked at her intently and with an innocent smile said that until then, she should keep quiet. Tia looked at Astera and asked if she understood. Her Astera took a deep breath and agreed with the young lady. She said that she would not tell anyone anything. The young lady knew perfectly well that what she was about to do today was completely harmless and a complete lie, but she knew that it was not something to worry about so much. She knew that now she was just a small 8-year-old child. She understood that even if she was discovered entering the restricted area of the Imperial Palace, no one would do anything to her. The man looked intently at his daughter and called her. Trembling with fear, he said that it was okay. If she was very nervous, he asked if she remembered her grandfather's words. He looked intently at his daughter and, trembling with fear, said that he would definitely protect her. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why her father was so fearful and timid. She sat closer to her father and said with a smile that everything was fine. The young lady understood perfectly well that today everyone would think that she was simply lost and no one would suspect her. For sure she knew that, because of her child's body, she was limited in many ways. But at the same time, her child's body gave her many advantages. A moment later, they heard some noise. Gallagher froze for a moment and asked warily what happened. The Imperial Palace guards looked at them intently, and a moment later, the knight said that they should remain calm as they simply needed to conduct an inspection. The knight looked at them intently and asked if they could leave the carriage first. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect the knights to inspect her family's carriage at all. She was puzzled because she knew that this medicine was only available by prescription because it was a very strong concentrate. She understood that if she got caught, she would have problems. Gallagher looked at them closely and introduced himself, and also said that he had received an invitation from the imperial family. Gallagher looked at the knights intently and said that their treaty with the imperial family was not yet broken. He asked if there had been any precedents before the knight asked for forgiveness and said that they were asking for assistance. Tia understood that she had been able to enter the imperial palace freely in their carriage, but now they were being inspected as soon as they entered the palace grounds. Gallagher looked closely at the knights and asked if this was an order from the Empress. The knight asked for forgiveness and bowed. The young lady thought for a moment and realized that this first move of pressure was initiated by the Empress again. She understood that she didn't need to just sit there now, because if she got caught, they would definitely start interrogating her. She was very scared and didn't know what to do or how to hide the medicine, but a moment later, she figured out what she would do. Gallagher looked at the knights intently and said that he would assist in searching the carriage. He looked at them with cold fury and said that they should not even lay a finger on him, as a child. He also forbade them to touch him unceremoniously. He looked at them sharply and said that he had the right to enforce these demands, and if they did not want to lose their place because of a stupid attempt, they must observe the rules of decency. The knights looked closely at the young man and said that they did not notice anything suspicious, so he could return to the carriage. He turned around and sighed heavily at the end. He sighed heavily and told his daughter that they could continue on their way. He sighed heavily and asked if his daughter was very scared, but he froze in surprise when he saw that the carriage was open and his daughter was not there. Meanwhile, the young lady slowly made her way through the forest. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was very strange, because her eyes certainly could not deceive her. From a distance, she definitely saw a man who looked like a prince, but she was surprised because she knew that he could not be in such a place. She looked into the distance in surprise. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had left in a hurry. Tia mentally asked her father for forgiveness because she could not miss such a chance. She knew that after the first prince became the crown prince and coldly destroyed their family, Tia collected all her last pennies and could barely buy a drop of information about him from the secret guild. To control them, the Empress placed the prince and his mother in a remote palace located in the forest west of her own palace. Or rather, she simply imprisoned them there and erased the very fact of their existence. After the death of the prince's mother, the Empress fed the little prince poison for a long time in such doses that he would not die immediately, and in the end, even though he survived, he developed severe insomnia as a complication. She understood that she had never been able to use this information, but now she understood that this information could have been of great service to her. She wanted to quickly find the prince and give him the medicine. A moment later, she noticed the prince in the distance. She realized that it was clear from one glance that he was a prince. She was confused and didn't understand what he was doing. She noticed that he was eating grass. She came closer to the prince and told him to calm down because she would not harm him. She froze in place for a moment, in shock. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked in confusion what he was eating now, his exhausted appearance. Tia was in complete shock as he was now eating grass in front of her. She came closer to him and quickly grabbed his hand. She shouted for him to stop because she did not understand what he was doing. She looked at him in surprise and asked him angrily why he was eating grass. The prince mumbled something inaudibly. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was saying. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, said that his stomach hurt. The prince said that he had been having stomach pains lately. The book said that it would get better if he ate the leaves. She sighed heavily as she now understood how he had actually survived. She knew that in front of her now sat a little boy. He had no mother who could cheer him up and hug him. He lived in the imperial palace in which his father had forgotten about his existence. He tore and ate the grass that could help him according to his meager knowledge. The young lady, with her lightning speed, reached into her bag and said that he should not eat such things anymore because she brought him medicine. The prince looked at her in surprise because he did not expect such a thing. She looked at the prince intently and quickly handed him a small bag of medicine. He asked in surprise who she was. Firenze looked at the prince and introduced herself. He sighed heavily and took her medicine and introduced himself. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was crying. Tia, with lightning speed, began to wipe away her tears so that he should not misunderstand her. Ferris sighed heavily and asked if he was really that pathetic. The young lady was shocked. She shouted that it was not, so he said that everything was fine because his mother and nanny thought so, and they said that he was pathetic and unhappy. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they were both no longer alive. Tia was in shock. She did not understand why such a small child was forced to listen to such things. She asked if he really didn't have a nanny. Ferris sighed heavily and said that his nanny had recently been fired. Ferris said that his nanny did not want to leave at all, but unfortunately, she was taken away by the guards. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She was furious because she realized that the Empress was simply merciless. In her previous life, when she heard that the Empress was slowly dying in the far palace without the ability to call a doctor, she thought that the prince was simply heartless. She wondered if it was necessary to stoop to such a level to repay the suffering he had gone through. However, looking at him, she now understood that everything was very difficult. She understood that the Empress deserved this. A moment later, the prince handed her the small bag back and said that for this reason she should not help him. Tia looked at the prince in surprise. She did not expect this at all. He looked at her intently and with a cold, exhausted look said that he was returning her medicine as she could die if she helped him. Tia, in turn, shouted that this would not happen and that she would not die. He asked in surprise why she was so sure. A moment later, they turned around at the noise. He sighed heavily and said that all the people who had treated him well were either dead suffering or disappearing. He said that for this reason, she should leave immediately because she can't be here. Tia, with tears in her eyes, shouted that she was not going anywhere, and he was a fool. She looked at him intently and said that in that case, he should grab onto someone and ask for help, but she knew that he could not do that. She sighed heavily and said that he should not worry in vain, since no one would be able to touch her. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked why she was so sure. She shouted that her grandfather was a very important person, and he would definitely protect her, so he didn't have to worry about her. She was heavy and said that she would definitely help him. A moment later, the young lady handed the prince the candies. She said that he should accept everything and listen to her carefully. She came closer to him and said that she didn't have time, so he should listen to her carefully. She said that now he had to do several things. Tia looked at the prince intently and said that he should take medicine several times a day. She told him about the dosage of the drugs. She also said that in the presence of others, he should pretend to be sick. She looked at him closely and said that his stomach hurt because someone was constantly feeding him something bad. But if he suddenly got better, then that person would definitely decide to harm him in other ways. She looked at the prince intently and wondered if he was listening to her. She saw the blank expression on his face. Tia sighed heavily and said that, of course, they were seeing each other for the first time, and she knew that it was hard for her to believe. Ferris looked closely at the young lady and said that he believed her because she said she wanted to help him. He said that she was the first person to tell him so, besides his nanny, but he still couldn't do anything. The young lady shouted that she gave him medicine. She understood that he thought that she was on the same level as the Empress. She sighed heavily as he had spoiled her mood. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if he should live. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear anything like that at all. The prince's face sank, and he said that before his mother died, she took him by the hand and told him that he should live. He was puzzled because he understood that everyone was trying to bring about his death, and that was why it was very difficult for him. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her with empty eyes if she thought he should really continue to live. Tia froze in shock on the spot. She didn't expect such a question from him at all. The moment she heard his words, she felt unbearably ashamed of all her past thoughts. She sighed heavily and asked the prince for forgiveness. He looked at her in surprise, because he did not understand what she was asking for forgiveness for. She knew that his mother should have died at that time. But once he entered the academy, he immediately showed himself to be an outstanding person. Even though she knew what the situation was, she thought that he would be fine. His life for her was just a couple of lines on a piece of paper from an informant. She didn't even try to think about how hard each of his days was. She knew that he would later become the crown prince of the empire and take revenge. He was ruthless to everyone. For this reason, she believed that he could cope well with a slightly cruel environment. She sincerely asked him for forgiveness for not being able to come earlier. She knew that she couldn't do it, so to speak. He sighed heavily and said that he understood what she wanted to tell him. She looked at him intently and said that she wished he lived. The prince was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. Tia screamed and said with tears in her eyes that she believed he should live. She knew that right now it was all she could do for him. She looked at him intently, as she really hoped that her words would give him the strength to survive. She knew that after he went through the dark and difficult time, he would shine brighter than anyone, just like in the future that she knew. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was crying again, and also asked if she wanted some candy. Tia shouted that it would be fine, and she gave them to him to eat. The young lady in turn cursed. She did not understand why she was crying again. A moment later, she turned around as she heard a painfully familiar voice. She looked closely at the prince and said in a hurry that it was time for her to go leaving. Tia said that he should not forget her words. Ferris's face sank as he didn't want her to leave at all. Tia came closer to him and stroked his head tenderly. Tia looked at him with a smile and said that he should take his medicine regularly, and he should also go somewhere far away from people and wave a piece of wood. Tia said that the next time she came, she would bring him a book that would help him. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. She smiled and said that she would definitely come next time. A moment later, they sealed their promise. As she left, she shouted that she would come to him as soon as possible. He looked intently after the young lady, for he knew that he would certainly be waiting for her. He saw her running away from him, but still he felt very warm in his soul. Some time later, the young lady fell onto her bed with a thud, as she had had a very hard day. She sighed heavily as she felt a heaviness in her stomach. Gallagher ran to his daughter with lightning speed. He was very excited. The emperor said with a smile that he was very pleased to see two key families of the empire who had joined forces. The young lady was furious because the emperor put them on the same level as another family. But still, something surprised her very much: that her insanely fearful father unwaveringly opposed the emperor and empress. She did not expect this at all. He looked at the imperial family with cold fury and said that they had been stopped for inspection, and for this reason, his daughter was very frightened. He looked at the emperor with his cold fury and asked if this could really be a simple misunderstanding. The young lady understood perfectly well that the emperor's answer did not surprise her at all. He smiled and said that since the knights of the imperial family were distinguished by their great loyalty, they decided to take such an unfair step towards his friends. The empress said with a grin that they were still not accustomed to the current order. She looked at the young man intently and asked him to be generous to them. She looked at him with a very cold and angry gaze. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the empress was hostile towards them. She knew that the imperial family really wanted to destroy her family. Tia in turn understood perfectly well that everything very good had already happened today. She was glad and knew that she was lucky that she was able to quickly find the prince and give him the medicine. She knew that her memories from past lives would definitely be useful for the new future. She understood perfectly well that she couldn't really count on them, because now many things were going differently. She knew that her father had attracted attention that he had not had in his past life, that a crack had appeared in her relationship with the empress, that the young prince would not suffer from the poison and would gradually recover. She was puzzled and didn't know when small changes would affect the future, but she hoped that at least today he would sleep normally and his night would not be filled with pain. The prince thought for a moment about what the young lady had told him. He took the medicine slowly as she told him to. He happily ate the candy after taking the medicine. For a moment he thought, and remembered the young lady, her appearance, and her words. She said that she would definitely help him. He remembered her telling him with tears in her eyes that he had to live. He lay quietly on the bed, hugging the candy and medicine. Some time later, the young lady woke up with a bang. She knew that she had to become even more industrious in order to properly find out everything she thought she already knew. She understood perfectly well that from today on, the word later was no longer in her vocabulary. Some time later, she came to her new friend. Estira looked at the young lady in surprise, and also asked how her trip to the imperial palace went. Tia looked at her with a smile and said that they should go and get a letter of recommendation. The young lady in turn knew that admission to the academy required an application, and the deadline for submitting applications was approaching soon. Tia knew that Estira was the doctor's best student, and her talent for pharmacy kindness, honesty, and devotion made the doctor very proud of her. The doctor looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really talking about this year's letter of recommendation. He looked at the young ladies and said that, unfortunately, he had already written it to another student. Tia was shocked She didn't expect to hear something like that at all. He said that he wrote a letter to another student whom he taught several years ago. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he did it. A moment later, they left the doctor's office. Tia sighed heavily and apologized to her friend. She said that she would definitely get another letter of recommendation for her. The young lady was furious. She realized that she had been careless. She knew that a letter of recommendation from a doctor was equivalent to a free pass to the academy. She sighed heavily and said that she had something to do first. She looked at the girl intently and said that she would try to do everything in her power. Estera looked at the lady and said that she had heard that a research position at the academy required deeper knowledge and honed skills than the regular course. Gina Lady listened intently to her new friend. She smiled and said that although she was the doctor's student, she was still young and had a lot to learn, or that was the reason the doctor gave the letter of recommendation to another person. She looked at the young lady closely and said that she was very grateful to her for everything she had done. She said that she would definitely work hard and practice more, and she would definitely get in next year. Tia was furious. She knew she didn't have time to wait that long. She grabbed her friend's hand and said that she had to listen to her. She looked at the girl intently, as she knew that she had to send her to the academy this year at any cost. Estira looked at the lady with a gentle smile, asked if she had calmed down. Tia sighed heavily and said that she had calmed down, and also asked for forgiveness. Estira was comforting the young lady right outside the doctor's office. Tia knew that the injustice had thrown her too far off track. Estira smiled and offered the young lady a cup of tea. She smiled and said that unfortunately, she didn't have any snacks, so she made some sweet herbal tea. The young lady thanked her and began to drink tea. Estira looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had really wanted to console her recently. Tia hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Estira said with a smile that everything was fine and that it was quite predictable. She smiled and said that, of course, she would be lying if she said that she had no hope at all. Tia sighed heavily and said that she would definitely find another letter of recommendation. She looked at the girl intently and said that she had one question for her. Tia looked at her intently and asked why she was constantly putting herself down. Estera hesitated and said that she could not answer this question. A moment later, she said with a smile that she was still young and didn't know everything. Tia looked at her closely and said with a smile that at this age, she was already an apprentice to the family doctor. Tia told the girl that the doctor uses almost all the medicines she made when treating patients. She said that most of her medications, which she invented herself, are so effective that the doctor himself can use them. She said with a smile that there really was nothing special about it. Tia looked at her closely and said that she didn't know much about medicine, but she understood that the main thing was the preparation of the medicine. She told the girl that her medicines were direct proof of her skill. She sighed heavily and told the young lady that she knew her place very well. Tia thought for a moment as she understood the young girl perfectly. She was a commoner woman and still very young, and most likely she had suffered many insults and neglect. She understood her perfectly well, since in her past life she had been treated in a similar way. She sighed heavily as she knew that she was going too far, since the previous Astira had successfully entered the academy without her help. She looked at the girl intently and said that she would like to offer her something. She looked at her intently and said that she had already agreed to accept the letter of recommendation. She told her friend in all seriousness that she did not deserve to be oppressed at all. She shouted that she would get a letter of recommendation for her from her grandfather. Estera froze for a moment in shock, as she had not expected this. But a moment later, she finally understood the young lady's words. Tia sighed heavily and said that letters of recommendation from the head of the family are not given to everyone they meet. She looked at her intently and said that for this reason, she would have to prove her worth on her own. Tia told her that she had to prove that she could live up to their family's trust. Estira was shocked. She screamed that this was too much. She was puzzled and did not know how she dared to ask for such a thing. The young lady looked at her intently and said that she would not force her, and if it was a burden to her, she would not promote her, but she offered it with confidence that the young lady could manage it. Tia told her that even if she failed, it was no big deal, since she herself said that preparing for admission would just be postponed for 1 year. Sometime later, the Duke and his assistant were busy with family affairs when suddenly they turned around as they heard a knock at the door. The young lady quietly peeked out from behind the door and called her grandfathers. The Duke looked at his granddaughter with a smile and asked if she had really come to play with him. She looked at them intently and said that she had come today on business. The man was puzzled, as he did not expect such a thing. The Duke looked at his granddaughter with a smile and asked what he could help her with. The young lady looked at the Duke with a keen, predatory gaze. She smiled and said that she needed a letter of recommendation to the Academy on behalf of the Duke. They froze in shock on the spot. The man sighed heavily as he realized that the young lady had recently heard someone's conversation in a similar way. She turned around and told the librarian that she needed his recommendation as well. The man froze in place in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing from the young lady. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in her grandfather's office, eating cookies. She told the Duke everything, and he thought about her words for a while. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that when it came to medicine, the young lady could handle anything. The librarian looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if that girl was really so good at preparing medicines. Tia looked at them closely and said that they themselves use her medicines. She told the man that he recently cut his hand badly, and with the help of her ointment, he was able to recover much faster. The young lady smiled and said that she personally watched the girl do it. The man was shocked. He did not expect to hear something like that at all. He looked at the Duke and said that if the young lady was telling the truth, then the girl needed to go and develop her talent at the academy as soon as possible. The Duke looked closely at his knight and said that recently she came and asked for a sculpture, and now for a doctor. She smiled and said that it seemed that she attracted talented people to herself. He looked at her intently and said that the letter would be a little difficult. The young lady was momentarily upset, as she did not expect this. The Duke smiled and said that she need not be upset, since with the librarian's recommendation, there would be no problem with admission. She looked at them intently and said that in that case, she would prove it. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. She smiled and said that she would prove to them that the young lady was very capable. She looked at the Duke intently and said that he would personally evaluate her and decide how capable she was. She smiled and said that if the medicine satisfied him, he would definitely write a letter of recommendation, and not only him. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that although she said such words very bravely, but now she was very worried, because she did not know whether the young lady could handle the task. She knew she had to impress two men. She was puzzled and did not know which medicine would be ideal for them. She didn't know what to do and knew she had to come up with something quickly. She sighed heavily as no thoughts came into her head. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she did not understand why her father was in such a state. She was puzzled because she thought that he was about to crush her to death with his sigh. She glanced sideways at her father because she understood that she wouldn't be able to come up with anything right away, so she wanted to deal with him right away and clear her head at the same time. She looked at her father closely and asked why he was sighing so heavily. She smiled and asked if something was bothering him. He smiled and said that nothing was bothering him. He was just thinking about something a little. Tia smiled and told her that if something was bothering him, he could share it with another person. He fought back and said he really didn't have any problems. She looked at him intently, and he couldn't help himself. He sighed heavily and said that he was thinking about one more thing. Gallagher said that unfortunately he has no experience, so he can't decide. Tia smiled and asked if he really wanted to open something of his own, other than the ingenious fabric. Tia looked closely at her father and said with a smile that she was very interested in what it was. A moment later, he told his daughter everything. He looked at his daughter closely and asked if this was too difficult for her. Tia was shocked by her father's brilliant idea. She sighed heavily and said that it was difficult. He looked at her closely and thought with a smile that this was difficult for her because she was still very young. He smiled and said that she listened to him, and it gave him strength. She knew that he simply would not believe her if she said something like that. Tia looked at him intently and said with a smile that he should listen to her. She looked at her father and asked with a smile why he didn't ask the teacher for advice. He looked at her in surprise as he didn't expect that. She smiled and said that the teacher was always willing to help if someone asked him something. Gallagher thought for a moment about what his daughter had told him. She knew that this was a very good decision, and so she knew that it would be better if her father talked to the teacher so that they could get closer. Gallagher smiled and told his daughter that he would go if she said so. A moment later, the young lady had a brilliant idea about her problem. She knew that her grandfather and the librarian were elderly and spent a lot of time sitting. She rose with lightning speed, and Gallagher looked at his daughter in surprise. He called her in surprise, but she creaked like lightning and said that she had to go. She, running away, told her father that she urgently needed to meet her friend. Gallagher was surprised because he knew it was already late evening. She shouted that she would come quickly. The young lady ran to her friend. She shouted and called her. With lightning speed, the young lady rushed into her arms. Estira was shocked. She did not expect such a thing from the young lady. The young lady was very happy because she knew that she would be able to fulfill her friend's wish. Sometime later, Estira was preparing medicine for the young lady. She sat and wrote down all her preparations for the medicine. Suddenly, she turned around because she heard the doctor enter her office. She looked at the teacher in surprise and asked what brought him here at such a late hour. He sighed heavily and said that he had come to see her for a short while. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing.